Those for 3.
So about 4 of our colleagues here.
Yes, absolutely. We're having discussions about what we're going to do is to introduce really high quality local. So for the third year, yeah, so we've got a really genuine choice. Yeah, so yeah. Well, he did that here 2 or 3 times successfully.
I mean, the students, of course,
We decided to name it so we offer a yin and a yang, so the average.
yeah. And the student market, I think, now has changed.
That's more of a discussion. So here, I think you just throw it out there.
And it's good to have the options available.
I close mine down.
So where is it?
Me too. Devon Access to Services. Yeah, I work with volunteers. Feel a bit out of depth there. It's all right, I work with volunteer drivers who are absolutely wedded to their diesel.
Driving, just accessibility.
Well, no, just getting people to hospital, people who can't use any other form of transport. They're essential journeys, and they can't go on a bus.
Just on the LinkedIn. Yeah, they're doing quite a lot of work at the moment on the access.
Oh, yeah.
Research.
Oh, right.
It's starting to move away from what we talk about. Again, we're just back to
I left the office.
Yeah. Well, I got really one sentence. Health services got to plan how people get there. Because Derriford's full, Ideally's full. They just went, yeah, we'll move all our services. No, nothing about. No. So what's the answer? Build a bigger car park.
Of course, yeah. And make it free for everyone.
British Airways.
Yeah, just like that.
The business stuff is cheaper than the company does.
So it's live now, okay? Okay, great, thank you. Are we recording on YouTube? Did you want to introduce us? Is that okay? I think we're just... sorry to interrupt the conversation.
So how do you, so if
Are we full now? I lose the seat. Because it's just a bit tight here, isn't it?
yes. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the University of Plymouth. My name is John Shaw. I'm a professor of transport geography here. And until recently, I was head of geography, and we were just talking about our moves to try and bring hugely down the carbon footprint of our geography field trips, which is an exciting development. So in the context of this Devon Climate Emergency, that was very good news indeed. And the latest thematic hearing of the Devon Net Zero Carbon Task Force. Welcome, as I say, to the university, to our new sustainability hub here. And it's a facility that we can bring together staff, students, businesses, social enterprise, community groups, and so on, from all over Devon to collaborate in sustainability initiatives. So in order to crack on with today's event and to introduce you to the format, I'll pass over to Kerry and Nick, who are going to be chairing it for us today.
Thank you very much, John. Just before we get going, I'll ask my co-chair, Kerry, to introduce herself and her affiliation, and then we'll go through the agenda.
Hi everybody, so my name's Kerry. I'm from an organisation called Regen. We are an organisation based in Exeter who are trying to accelerate the transition to a decarbonised, decentralised and democratic energy system. So I sit on the Net Zero Task Force, representing predominantly the energy sector. However, at Regen we've been doing more and more work looking at the links between the transition to a sort of more low carbon transport system and how that's going to impact with the electricity system, which is where my interest today comes from. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll pass back to Nick.
Thank you. So just by way of a bit of introduction, I'm Nick Bowyer. I'm an Associate Director in Transport Planning at AECOM. I'm primarily here in my role, though, as Chair of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation for the South West region. So that's the region that covers all the way down from Swindon through Bournemouth, all the way down to the Isles of Scilly. I have a background in geography in terms of my academic training, part of which was climate change studies up at the University of Exeter. Professor Stuart Barr sat down the end. I had his sustainability lectures, I think, around 11, 12 years ago. So it's good to see you here, Stuart. So just in terms of a bit of an introduction and overview to the day, this is the fourth hearing that the Net Zero Task Force has held so far. We have had 2 hearings on food, land and sea, one on the built environment as well, which took place last week. This week we have the mobility hearing today, focusing primarily on transportation, but also the related energy matters that Kerry has raised. And we have an energy and waste hearing tomorrow, which Kerry is co-chairing as well. So Kerry's having a very busy week. And then we have a summary hearing next week on the 11th, back here at Plymouth, where we're looking at many cross-cutting themes that we can't cover in their own hearing, such as spatial planning, behaviour change, which I expect actually are going to come up quite heavily today. So just in terms of the process today, I do just have to remind you that we are all being recorded today. This is going out on YouTube and Facebook Live, I believe. So in terms of the privacy statement, I would just like to say that on behalf of the Devon Climate Emergency Response Group, it's okay, it's not in HD, you'll be fine. Devon County Council will act as the data controller for any personal data that you provide to us, specifically images and video collected and broadcast today. As such, Devon County Council will ensure that the data that you give us is processed in line with our organisation's data protection policies and in line with your rights under the Data Protection Act of 2018 and the European Union General Data Protection Regulations. More information is available on the privacy notice, which you should all have a copy of. And can I just ask for clarity, does anyone object to being filmed? I'll take that silence as agreement. So just before we get going, in terms of rules of engagement, I would just like to say that we have a microphone with us today. The microphone won't change our sound in the room. It's just being used to make sure we can be picked up on the recordings. And I'd like to just set the ground rules in terms of this is a public discussion. It's not a debate, and the purpose is to explore options and solutions. Please, during the discussion, if you can refrain from having side conversations or talking over each other, that would be really helpful and appreciated. One, to show the respect for other participants, but also in terms of helping the recording and helping people take notes appropriately. And when you speak in, we are time limited, so if you are able to be brief and to the point, that would be much appreciated. Okay, I think in terms of one other thing I want to pick up just before we go into the context, we have had a evidence submission open to the public. That evidence submission was curtailed on the 10th of November purely for the purposes of this hearing. It's still ongoing in the background. Kerry and myself have only considered evidence that was submitted up to the 10th of November as part of what we will talk about today. One thing that we do want to be upfront about is the gender split in the room and sort of just where we're going in terms of diversity. You'll see it's very heavily male-dominated. I'm pleased to say that in terms of the evidence that we've received so far, we're actually at a 50-50 split, which is really great. So we've had 104 submissions that were considered up until the 10th of November, and I think 53 of those were submitted by women. So that's great. I think, is there anything you want to add, Kerry, just on that?
Yeah, just on that, I'd quite like to make it very clear we did try and get more women along here. In a number of cases, women deferred to male counterparts, and in a number of cases they weren't able to come. So it was at the forefront of our mind, given any transition to net zero is going to require the entire population, and so it's more than a nice to have. It was quite important to us to have all views represented, so just wanted to be upfront about that ahead of starting.
Thank you. So just setting this conversation in context, so the Committee for Climate Change, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, has noted that domestic transport now accounts for 28% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. That is primarily surface transport, so the likes of car, freight, public transport. Including the aviation sector, this figure rises to 35%. That's on the official calculations. Now, across Devon, Plymouth and Torbay, we're very fortunate to have had the University of Exeter undertake some analysis for us, and that demonstrates that the greenhouse gas production of the county broadly mirrors the national values. So 29% of Devon's emissions are surface transport, primarily composed of road, 28%, 1% rail. A point that is worth noting is that around 2% of the county's emissions are potentially related to Exeter Airport. It is very difficult, however, to analyse that in any particular detail, so that number should be treated a little bit cautiously. I think really just in terms of some context setting of where we are, it's worth noting that transportation is now the single biggest sector emitting greenhouse gases in the country. That is also the picture in Devon. Since 1990, there has been very little change in the emissions output of the transport sector, whilst the industrial and power sectors in particular have witnessed large reductions in emissions. Transport has essentially flatlined. And I think this is really why we want you all around the table today and to have your ideas, and why it's really important that we try and understand what we can do to decarbonise the transportation sector. In terms of where we are today, between 2012 and 2017, transport is the only major sector that has witnessed an increase in emissions output. So clearly we're going in the wrong direction of travel. And whilst cars have demonstrated some efficiency improvements over that period, this is being offset both in terms of traffic growth that is happening, but also the fact that the public are purchasing larger vehicles. In terms of emissions by mode, around 42% of emissions are by car, 12% by HGVs, 11% by LGVs. There is a significant role, therefore, for the freight industry. We are lucky that the Road Haulage Association has submitted evidence, but unfortunately they weren't able to make it in person today. But we do have evidence available for the committee for us to consider that. And just in terms of the policy context, we are operating in an environment where grants for low emission vehicles have been cut. Fuel duty has been frozen repeatedly, and bus and train fares are rising. In particular, you'll have noted in the press over the weekend that rail fares are due to go up another 2.8% in January. Petrol and diesel cars are due to be phased out by 2040, and I think we need to consider, is that early enough? And what can Devon do potentially to influence that? So I'm going to stop talking before I take all the time up. But just in terms of a background today, we do have witnesses here, I'm pleased to say, from across the transport spectrum. So we have community transport represented, we have shared mobility, the energy sector is here, and I think there's a really important role for the energy sector in understanding if there is sufficient capability in the grid to charge EVs, if EVs is the way that we want to go, and what other changes could be brought about. We have experts in sustainable transport and in active travel and behavioural change, and I think behavioural change is an area where we haven't really necessarily got to grips with it as an industry well enough, and clearly that's going to have a huge role going forward. How do we get people out of private travel? And also we have public transport operators represented here in the form of Stagecoach. So just before we go on to actions briefly, I'd just like to pass the microphone around. Just please give a very brief introduction and your affiliation.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name's Ollie Frankland. I'm a project manager at Regen, and I lead our electric vehicle work and team. Thanks.
I'm Paul Jewell. I'm the DSO Development Manager at Western Power Distribution. We're the network operator for the South West, but also South Wales and the two Midlands areas.
Hi, I'm Mike Watson. I'm Interim Managing Director for Stagecoach South West, and we run bus services in Plymouth, Devon, and a bit in Cornwall and also Torbay.
Hello, I'm Mark Hodgson, MD of Co-Cars. We operate on-demand shared mobility cars and electric bikes across the South West.
Hi, I'm John Shaw, Professor of Transport Geography at the University of Plymouth.
Hello, I'm Stuart Barr, I'm Professor of Geography at University of Exeter.
I'm Kirsty, I'm just here to take notes.
Will Pratt from the Transport Planning team at Devon County Council.
Tim Burns from Sustrans, Senior Policy and Partnerships Advisor and head up the Bike Life programme across the UK and Ireland.
Tim Lammerton, Devon Access to Services. I work mostly with volunteer car schemes across the county.
Jolt Schuler, freelance sustainable transport planner, mostly working in Devon and Exeter.
Liz O'Driscoll, Managing Director of Exeter City Futures, curating the carbon neutral roadmap for Exeter City.
Hi, Gabriel von Drausch from Sungift Energy. We design and install sustainable energy systems, including electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
Hi, I'm Emily Reid, and I'm the project manager for Zero Carbon Devon.
And I'm Kerry, as I've already said. I didn't actually say what I do at Regen. I'm a project manager as well, so I'm working on this project and also on looking at how we decarbonise heat in Bristol.
Thank you very much. One final thing, just I did neglect to mention there are no fire alarms planned, so if one does go off, your exits are here or behind us. Okay, so we are 1 minute over schedule at the moment, which I think is not bad going. So we'll just kick off the first section. The first section is really looking at actions, and I'm going to ask you each in turn, just in 2 minutes, to explain what actions do we need to take on this theme of mobility to enable rapid and extensive decarbonisation in the transport sector within Devon. And Emily has kindly volunteered to take notes for us.
I'll try and do it justice.
So we will pass this round in 2 minutes, please. Kerry is the enforcer.
Okay, it's going to be harsh. So I would say that there's an opportunity, everyone's looking at mobility hubs in terms of trying to get big uptake and make sure there's enough charging infrastructure in Devon. And there's quite a few projects in the pipeline that are looking at that at the moment. Coming from an energy perspective, we'd be very keen to make sure there's as much local generation in terms of solar farms and wind farms that could potentially link in with those energy hubs, and trying to ensure that we're not just necessarily using all grid electricity there, we're using clean forms of electricity. So that's one point. I'd also like to emphasise the option for, or the slightly sticky area of agriculture and plant machinery, so tractors, heavy goods vehicles. They're going to be a lot more challenging to decarbonise. So I think there's some work to do potentially around that, looking at using biomethane. There are some interesting articles already done by the NFU on electric tractors, hybrid tractors, but obviously being a very agricultural county, I think there's an area there. And finally, really quickly, I think it's a big carbon impact at Exeter Airport, but the kind of future growth of the airport and growth in passenger numbers is potentially a bit unsustainable. And I think there's potentially for a chance to have a look at a frequent flyer levy, which has kind of been recommended by the Committee on Climate Change potentially, and options for using some of that income and some of that value to do good things in Devon. Yeah, on time, under time. I'll go for that.
I'm going to pick up on Ollie's theme because it is about network connections in our world. We will be looking firstly to make sure that all of the mobility that needs to connect can connect and make use of decarbonised energy. So back to what Ollie was saying, it's about renewable generation being used and energy being stored locally and used locally. But also our grid being able to support that in a more general sense. We need to forecast demand and predict usage. Most of the network that we build is in place for 50 or 60 years. So we've got to get it right now for the future. And part of that prediction, with the title being mobility rather than just electric vehicles, is trying to work out how people are going to use transportation as a solution in the future. Will we get 30 million electric vehicles to replace the 30 million cars that are on the roads in the UK at the moment, or will that model change? But again, the underlying thing for us is ensuring the network is big enough to support that decarbonised energy usage and accept the generation that produces that decarbonised energy.
So, from our perspective, some of the efforts that we've made in recent years is one, driving down the number of emissions from our own vehicles. So, a significant movement to investment in Euro 6 technology. And also looking at ways that we can work with our partners to deliver much greener technology, such as electric buses, something we're very keen to do. I think what then comes is us assessing our premises and how we can then make best use of those. Can we do? Can we implement more solar energy with that local power source, but also Can the network provide for power for electric buses? I think that's something else that's very important. So something we're looking at the current time. I think in terms of the wider transport landscape, we hoped that clean air zones would provide an opportunity to legislate, but we feel that they've really fallen short of tackling the private car, which is the big producer of pollutants in the atmosphere, and we feel that there's opportunities there really, and also like goods vehicles. So that would be our perspective at the current time.
Okay, so given the average car gets used 4% of its time, a third of cars don't move in a day, and about 40% of cities are dedicated to car use or car parking. There's both a misalignment of space allocation and a misuse of actually that space in terms of cost of the car. So I guess from our perspective, first of all, I'd like to see everybody who lives in a town or city within no more than 5 or 10 minutes of a shared car or asset. Clear action. Second action, I'd want to see that all new developments have e-mobility hubs. So Ollie's already talked about that, where we have bikes, buses, cargo bikes, trains, all intermodal. Those mobility hubs are both in cities, in towns, and in new developments. And those developments then are reducing their car parking on street rather than the current planning regime to a much tighter regime, maybe even 20% of cars. If we're looking at DFT forecasts, you know, it forecasts 27 million to go to another 9 million cars, which is ridiculous. The grid capacity just can't cope with that as well. The other thing I'd say is obviously from an e-mobility, we do electric bikes. We've seen a huge growth and interest in electric bikes. Obviously, we were the first in the UK to put those in, and I'd like to see a lot of those electric bikes, both shared and normal, encouraged vastly across cities and towns, whether through hubs, community centres. There's so many other health benefits as well. And I think lastly, from our perspective, we want integrated mobility, so we have interoperability across all the partners, so that whether it's bikes, cars, buses, you can just book and have one ticket through, and so it's really easy for people to have that, and they have very easy options, so no one is felt left out. Because I think one of the issues within the debate about e-mobility is that it can be very unequal, and I think it's really important to think about the equality of the provision of choice. We have both rural and urban, high income, low income. Cars, it's roughly around 40% of car, in land use allocation. It's higher than that in America.
Thanks very much. I think the key to acknowledge that the problem is sustainability is a social one, an economic one as well as an environmental one, and transport's fundamental to addressing all manner of policy problems across all of the sustainability themes that you're dealing with here today. And we haven't made it particularly easy for ourselves in this country in recent years, because we've had a succession of governments which has promoted the broader culture of letting the market decide rather than governing in terms of what might be a better direction. So I think clearly it's easy to say we need to reduce the need to travel overall. That's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. Some people may have to travel more, but so long as they do so within the context of travelling by more efficient modes, is the second key point I'd make. So that's, of course, bus, train, bike, walking, efficient in terms of movement of people capacity, but also in terms of fuel consumption and waste production. Electric vehicles are great, but they don't do anything to reduce the problem of congestion, which of course is an economic problem with sustainability. So if everybody moves to electric vehicles, the big problem there is that people feel great because they're not producing so many carbon emissions, and then just drive and produce more congestion, which is not very good. So in terms of policy responses, first thing, to promote these modes, these better modes, not just in terms of the specific interventions which you've heard about, but also broader cultural perspectives. In this country in particular, we've tended to follow the American model of promoting the private car at a cultural level, which probably needs to change. We need to promote behaviour change. All sorts of other policies, health policies, planning policies and so on have been mentioned in order to help us be able to do that. Of course, it's easy for us because none of us, at least around this table, are going to be elected government ministers. Well, we might be, but we're not at the moment elected government ministers enacting these proposals. So we need to help our politicians in, crucially, having the confidence to say no to people, because that's a really key message that needs to come out of this. People have to be told, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that.
I've worked for quite a long time now on behavioural change, and I thought it was interesting at the start that we know we're going to talk about behavioural change today, but I think behavioural change is an important part of a much broader package. And picking up from what John's just been saying, I would say that from the research we've undertaken with publics in Devon over many years now, well-being and the health and mental health benefits of active travel, I think, is really key here. And I think in delivering that, there's two things to think about. The first thing is what you might call the hardware of how we deliver this, which is partly what John's talked about, which is marrying up our planning system with transport planning, which we just do really badly. So we plan bad places to live. We've got to get to grips with that. We do not build and plan good places to live. Secondly, those places themselves are largely dysfunctional. They're poorly designed. The car is kind of built into the whole urban fabric, if we're talking about urban areas. We don't plan streets as spaces. We plan streets for cars. That is ridiculous. Streets are for people. We've got to get to grips with that. And then the final bit of the hardware is an exceptionally high quality, easy to use, information rich public transit system, which, as others have said already, is integrated and multimodal. That's just, again, it's not rocket science, done in lots of other parts of the world. And then there is the software. Once we've done those things, we can then begin to think about behavioural change. But my kind of point at this stage is we often try to do behavioural change before we enable people to be able to make that change.
I think I'd probably reiterate a few of the points made by John, Mark and Mike. I guess from first principles, it feels like the number one thing to do is reduce the number of trips being made. We know in the last 20 years, I guess the digital age has made a big impact on people's need to travel. Individuals are travelling 15% less. And if it wasn't for that change, carbon emissions from transport would be a lot worse than they are currently. But it feels like it's the number one thing to do. It's less travel. That's either using a digital alternative or stopping it altogether. And if they can't reduce trips, then I think it's a case of encouraging modal shift. walking and cycling within urban areas, public transport in urban areas and interurban corridors, and where it's not public transport or a mix of the two, an alternative to vehicle ownership. Shared mobility, I know Mark touched on it, but the national evidence is that people are buying more cars, but they're using each car less. And whilst that intuitively feels like a very negative thing, I think it also is a big opportunity that feels like we're approaching a point where shared mobility becomes more acceptable, particularly where other industries such as media, music are moving more towards shared approaches. And then the final thing we can't do those is looking to electrify what's left. But I think crucially it's about reducing a lot of the others first before we feel electrification is the solution. Particularly, I feel quite strongly that in urban areas people have a lot of choices, and just going to an electric car doesn't feel like it's the most sustainable solution. Whereas in rural areas, for example, we know in Exeter over 90% of people who live outside towns in Devon and live outside towns in Devon and work in Exeter, over 90% of them drive to work. It's also very difficult to capture them at source by public transport, so it feels like electric cars the solution for them. I guess trying to condense it into two priorities, it should be the measures that cross-cut those key themes. So I'd say sustainable links or enhancements, which include highway space reallocation, so reducing trips but also encouraging modal shift, and electric shared mobility. And one of the big aspirations in the city as part of the new transport strategy is moving towards a zero-emission transport subscription service.
Okay, I'm probably also going to echo a fair amount of what's already been said across the table. At Sustrans, I guess our starting point is, yes, we support a rapid transition towards electric vehicles and cleaner vehicles, but we know categorically that that won't get us to where we need to be, and therefore what we would probably say was behavioural change, i.e. the outcome of getting people out of their cars, reducing trips and the length of journeys by private motorised vehicles is absolutely key. And I think the Transport for Quality of Life recently did some research that showed that if 50% of vehicles were EV, by 2030 we'd need to see a reduction of about 60% of car trips in distance, which is based upon government targets and would require a rapid upscale in terms of transition. So reducing car use is absolutely vital in this. Three key areas that we see in terms of going about doing that. The first is very much about building neighbourhoods and not homes. We have a habit of just building homes in this country. We need to build places that people want to live in. We've done research recently that shows that people want stuff on their doorstep every day, local amenities, green space, friends, community, schools, fresh food, you name it. It shouldn't be a choice or a genuine choice of people that can afford it. It should be a choice for everyone to access those things. And we really need to change planning and build in transport and proximity alongside things like density and move away from young professionals being able to live in the city centre because that's the housing stock we provide. What about older people? What about families, etc.? Why do families have to move out in this country to afford a place that's space and car use? The second one is very much about making other modes more attractive than the car. People are inherently multimodal. They travel by what they perceive to be the most attractive, and we need to make public transport, walking and cycling, alongside other things like car share and other offers, the default. That means making public transport more reliable, reducing cost, making walking attractive and providing for cycling a decent network of space. I think for cycling, we're nowhere near where we need to be, and it is a missing link in a lot of our cities in the UK. And if you look at cities like Copenhagen that are considering, okay, final one is reducing car use, but I will talk more about that in a second.
It's for my issue. It's planning access to health services for people who have no access to a car. They can't use a bus. They've moved beyond that. They're old. They have no memory. The digital offer to them is no good because they've forgotten how to use the internet. So there's a network of volunteer car schemes across the country, but they have to travel long distances. So it's how do people with no options have some option, especially when health services, they put on a service for their own efficiency and effectiveness, but don't think how people are going to get there.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a couple of points. My first one is about, I work within local authorities, and I think we need to look at some widespread structural internal change within local authorities, looking not just at the policies, the practices, the allocation of budget. So it's been quite interesting working with some local authorities as the Fridays for the Future protests go outside, watching the transport planners who are building road schemes, looking out the window and then go back to their desks and carry on working. So there's a bit about defining what we mean by emergency. David Cameron talked about starting a cycling revolution, which would take 10, 20 years. That's not a revolution. What does artisan mean? All of these words, we need to reappropriate them for what does an emergency actually mean. Then, looking at the training for officers, some people are going to be more up to speed with this than others. So do we need a mandatory training program for officers and members and then get them to sign up to charters, working out whether themselves, are you part of the solution or part of the problem? We really need the leadership to demonstrate intent. So just at a recent meeting with a local authority where the chief exec was actively talking about car-free development, which then empowered the officers beneath him to push back at developers and others to sort of say, actually, this is what we're looking for. So we need leadership from the top, and we need to help them. Some of those leaders aren't as informed as they should be. And we need processes and tools that stop officers going off-piste and doing what they want to do, or letting their apathy or vested interests, a lot of people who will be carrying on driving to work are kind of half-heartedly trying to deliver sustainable transport things. So that's the kind of structural bit. And just underneath that, then we do a lot of carrots for active travel people.
Sorry.
Okay, yep. Yeah, sure.
Actions. Okay, so I've just got a list of actions here. I think going almost last, a lot of these are covered already. We've got to stop building new housing developments that are solely reliant on people owning a private car. We've got to build places for people. We've got to think about building and siting networks of work hubs and health hubs in the wider region so that people can access employment and healthcare without necessarily needing to travel the long distances into the urban centre. Within the urban centres themselves, we've got to think of policies that mean that we can mandate that public and shared vehicles within the city centre are all electric. Simply moving a private car to electric for me is not going to solve the problem. It's moving to networks of shared and public transport as well as active transport, and that needs to be electric, supported by comprehensive networks of charging points. We do need a reduction in private cars within the city centre to ensure that bus services are punctual, and therefore passenger numbers will increase because people know that that will be a reliable and high quality service. We need citywide mobility schemes that are multimodal to allow people the freedom and flexibility of choice. We should be looking at all employers taking on responsibility for this emergency as well, especially those with over 500 employees, and they should be launching active and shared travel schemes, and that should be part of their part of policy. I think that's everything I've got on my list. Networks of safe walking and cycling routes is the last one, supported by infrastructure in the city centre, such as changing and storage facilities to encourage people to use that as a mode of transport. Thank you.
Right. I guess I kind of a little bit more focused on maybe the sharp end of things rather than the wider picture. But I guess, I kind of see that the change to electric vehicles is coming, and it's coming probably pretty fast. I think, every manufacturer has got a pretty, I'd say, aggressive, most of them, aggressive plans to change their vehicle lineup over. And I think you'll find that in the next few years that the options available to people increase massively, and that will just increase the uptake for people to use them. But I think the change, depending on what you're trying to achieve, it will depend on the actions you take. So the change is going to happen anyway. It depends on how much do you want to spend to speed that change up. And so from the very sort of cheap end of just general awareness of how can an electric vehicle work for you, just, I guess, sharing experiences from people who have electric vehicles to people who don't have electric vehicles is just a very cheap, easy way of doing it. There is a lot of data now out there, so it's very easy to map out what electric vehicles can actually achieve, not just what the manufacturers say they can achieve. And then when you look at stuff, showing people not just what can be done with electric vehicles, but then the cost benefits as well, so the savings that can actually be achieved. And then I guess you're kind of onto different areas where, like workplace charging. So you've got two sort of real key. There's the grid connections for, sort of whether it's people's homes or businesses, but then off-street parking and workplace charging are probably two sort of real key points that are a big challenge for a lot of people. Installing electric vehicles, one of the real benefits of having an electric vehicle is taking advantage of off-peak and low-peak electricity tariffs. And so if you have off-street parking and you can't take advantage of that, that's going to be a real disincentive for people. Unfortunately, a lot of the charging infrastructure that is being built is linked to some very high-cost electricity, so it just makes it completely unattractive to use. And I think that's, again, you've got to build it somehow, but I don't think that really helps with the transition. And then when you're looking at workplace charging, at the moment, there is essentially no incentive for employers to put chargers in for their work stuff. So we do lots of workplace charging. It's always for the directors and their cars. And so they get the £500 grant towards a workplace charger, but the hundreds or whatever cars in the car parks, there's no incentive to put charging infrastructure in for that, and it is massively expensive, technically difficult, and will have all sorts of grid connection costs. So I think, yeah.
Thank you. Then that's really great, and we managed to keep that. We went 1 minute over, so I think that's pretty good. So we've got plenty of time to delve into all of those areas in some more detail. So considering everything you've just heard, and Emily has been furiously scribbling over probably countless pieces of paper to capture all of those actions, we want to understand, and we've touched on some of it already, but it'd be really useful if we could kind of tease out some of the barriers that are facing getting some of these actions from nice to haves to sort of being in place. So we want the barriers, we want the opportunities, and we want the barriers to implementing these. We want to work out how they could be overcome. Again, we've touched on some of them. And then we want to look at the wider social, economic and environmental benefits and opportunities that are coming through. And it's clear already that health and social mobility, excuse the use of the word mobility there, but that all can come into play with this. So we're going to reverse the direction to this time. So Gabriel, we're going to hear from you again now. We were just going for 2 minutes.
I think 2 minutes.
2 minutes maximum to pick up on maybe where I've cut you off, or maybe where you've picked up a barrier or an opportunity in somebody else's area. So I'm going to start with Gabriel again now.
Well, I guess, yeah, kind of where I left off. The main barriers we see are people who are interested in electric vehicles is I guess, first of all, is kind of lack of knowledge of what can actually be achieved, what they can be used for. There's everyone's got their little tales of a horror story of someone being stuck somewhere, or vehicles don't work in winter and all sorts of stuff. So I think generally, if there was some sort of campaign to just try and get rid of some of the mistruths that are out there about electric vehicles, and just trying to show people what can actually be achieved, and how almost ensuring that people are making the right choices so they don't end up with a vehicle that isn't suitable for them, because there is a huge amount of choice on what different vehicles can do. And I think that's a very kind of a low cost option is just an awareness building, which but then I think the main barrier that we see is that workplace charging. So there's a lot of people have to, drive to work. That's a real, there's a lot of companies we work with, especially, they're based in places where there isn't public transport, etc., to get there. So they are, there's probably more car sharing, etc., that could be done. But essentially, the car parks are full and overflowing with cars. And to try and offer incentives for people to be able to have the charging infrastructure to go in there is a real, technical challenge and cost. A really, sort of quite big cost. So I don't know what the solution is, but I see that as if you really want to increase the uptake of trying to incentivise the behaviour to improve that.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting to hear all of us from such different industries talking the same kind of issues around the table before. And actually, for me at the moment, the barriers really come around capability, capacity, and culture. Culture, I think, is a really big one. It's how we have the will to move from talking about this stuff when largely we can say we do know what we need to do. Why are we not doing it? And we need to move from talking and researching about it through to practical action. And for me, that means that we need to find ways to be comfortable to take risks, like we would do in an emergency. We won't get, I don't believe, to fully costed, risk-free options and have time to evaluate and trade them off one against the other and still do that in the time that we can actually make a difference. So we need to choose a course of action. And we need to deal with the issues case by case as they arrive, rather than trying to predict them all and take them out of the way before we start. I feel, and what I observe is that a lot of us, myself included, are almost paralysed by business as usual processes within our own organisations. We need to think about cultural reorganisation at every level and training and support for people to do things differently. And actually having a strong and shared narrative and that storytelling piece into the communities, into the people, into the businesses becomes absolutely critical to make that change.
I think probably quite a lot of us, certainly in the transport sector, aren't very good at understanding how to make change happen. I've worked on lots of promotional and marketing projects. It's nowhere near my background and completely out of my comfort zone. And we try to make the best with a room full of transport planners trying to come up with leaflets and campaigns. And it's just actually recognising where we're, I guess, incompetent without understanding that. I think we're also pretty poor at showing what the prize is. We're good in some of these things at saying what we're taking away, what you need to stop doing. People who've been told their whole life that a car is good, they're still told by amazing multi-million-pound adverts, and then I come along and say, you should stop doing that. You should be walking, you should be cycling, you should compare. And it's like, actually, you're telling me everything I've been told my whole life is a total load of nonsense. We need to be better at understanding this. We need to be better at selling the benefits, because actually the prize is huge. It's happier, healthier communities, it's places where we want to hang out with people, it's us living longer because we know our neighbours, and we need to be better at selling that through better visualisations, better engagement, and we need to involve those communities in helping coming up with the solutions themselves. We did a piece of work, 70% of people in Exeter were concerned about air quality, so what are you going to do about it? We need to be better at bringing those people in to actually doing something themselves.
I seem a little bit more focused on my passengers here. So this is people who are a combination of, example, older, frailer, poor or no memory. They've got to travel further and wait longer at their destination for basic healthcare and many social activities. So there are barriers, public transport. They can't physically walk to a bus stop. They can't sit at a bus stop. The design stops them doing that. Bus seats are uncomfortable. Journeys are longer. There may only be one wheelchair, scooter, pushchair space per bus. They can't remember the route. They won't remember how to use the internet. People over 75% are more likely to be lapsed users of the internet. And park and ride is very complicated for people with these issues. They can barely walk, never mind to get on a bus. There's problems with taxis and things. So volunteers use their cars. What we're finding the barriers to make effective use of that is centralised treatment in Devon. So high miles and no planning with the effect on people with poor mobility. Efficient use of resources doesn't always mean effective delivery of services. There's a concentration on acute services, not prevention. If people are fitter and healthier, they require that amount of help much later in life. There is a mindset of people in rural areas. I'm a prime example. I drove all the way down from Ilfracombe. And efficiencies in services, late notice, cancelled appointments make it very difficult to plan effectively ahead. You can't make the best use of the cheap bus fares and train fares if you only got your appointment yesterday for tomorrow. There is a decline of local bus routes. Alternative fuel vehicles are very expensive and don't have the range yet. A journey in Devon may easily be 100 miles, so charging points in hospitals would be very good if you could find enough, if all the drivers went to it. They pick high mileage volunteers who are gold dust, they deliberately choose diesel. And that's great until you get into the city centre where diesels are going to be banned. But are electric vehicles ready yet to replace those miles? So they've got the confidence to do it. And volunteer driving is an add-on. They don't have to do it. The primary motivation is meeting people and doing something useful. If it becomes difficult or unaffordable to drive, they will do something else. And then there's a large number of people who are effectively excluded from proper healthcare in older age.
So in terms of thinking about it from a UK-wide level, the biggest fundamental barrier is the fact that we have government policy that pushes us in exactly the opposite direction to what I think we're talking about around this table. So £30 billion on RIS2, for example, the roads investment strategy. The road to zero is a good starting point, but it has nothing on reducing car use. It's all about EVs. We still prescribe to predict and provide as a transport planning piece rather than deciding what vision we want to do and designing our built environment and transport, travel infrastructure around that. That creates huge barriers locally, I think, for Devon and other authorities, both in a city and a more rural context. I think there's a lack of ambition quite often, and a lack of people don't fully understand the scale of the challenge that we're facing, and the pace and the speed. And even if we did have that, the skills and the knowledge to be able to suddenly plough into creating that transition is immense. But we do know, I mean, on the positive side, that people support the reduction of car use in cities. We showed in Scotland very recently widespread support for reducing traffic on local streets and residential streets, banning cars outside schools at drop-off pickup times. Obviously low emission zones, clearance zones, and other measures in cities. So that's gaining in traction. There's a massive barrier around cycling in terms of urban context, in terms of road space, and that competition and the tension between different modes and not planning based upon the number of people that you can move, but still on cars. And things like walking prioritisation. No one wants to wait for 1 hour, hopefully not an hour, and a minute and a half to cross a main road or a two-stage crossing. We've got to make these environments more attractive to people. But I think just briefly on how these could be overcome, I think for all of those, there are cities and towns and context in the UK and Europe which have solved this that we can look to. There's incredible case studies out there.
So, I mean, from a local authority perspective, to start with, one is that, I guess, sticks or things that prevent usage are, I guess, challenging politically. And very much schemes are sort of dealt with on a yes or no basis rather than here's a set of options that get you to your goal and you have to pick one. And that democracy is representative, and most of the time when transport schemes are delivered, not always, but quite often, those negatively impact those within the area of the scheme. And in a world where proportional democracy and the local representative has a very strong, his view is taken very strongly on that, that is a challenge to overcome. In terms of public transport, I guess the obvious one to say is cost, and particularly rail schemes delivering them, but I guess there's obviously a financial viability of new services. But on that, changing networks is actually very difficult. Our railway system in this country is largely Victorian in nature. A lot of urban areas, take Exeter for example, is built upon a Roman road network. There's not a huge amount that could be done to change that. And although I guess we'll talk about planning for new developments, if you look at Greater Exeter area, which is Exeter, East Devon, Teignbridge, Mid Devon, 60% of the population of Devon, with growth in the next 25 years, that's only going to be a 20% increase in population. The challenge has got to be, or the most difficult part is addressing the 80% that exists there now. and that's obviously going to be harder than it is than planning for new developments. And I suppose my final barrier is having a clear strategy on electrification. There isn't anything coming at a national level. I don't think anyone knows it at a local level. The government's Road to Zero has got ambitions for seemingly one charge point for every house. Yet, in my view, infrastructure doesn't change very quickly. Do we provide it on street? Should it be provided at destinations like hospitals, retail centres? There's not really a clarity on where that is, or how many. I'm a strong believer. We've got a project that's going to put in about 150 charging points on street in Exeter. It's a gut feel, but I find it difficult to believe that we would need significantly more than that on street for the city in the long term. It's actually got to be a mix of destinations rather than individual plot basis.
So I've got 4 barriers, but they're also, as other people have said, 4 opportunities, which are to do with planning, design, symbolism, and actually personal experience, which I think is really important. I've said something about planning before, but I think that, as others have said, that the planning system, the way it's currently set out, does really work against us. And it's illustrative of how, in the local paper up in Exeter, you can read quite frequently about attempts to build out-of-town shopping centres, to build retail developments that are entirely dependent on the motor vehicle or the private vehicle. So I think there's a real problem there. So the opportunity there is that you could have transit-orientated planning, where each residential development has to be linked to a mass transit or cycle or walk-based strategy. So that's a real opportunity as well. Secondly, I've said something about design, but really, design is a huge barrier for us because at the moment it is promoting greater levels of mobility when it could actually be suppressing them to a certain extent. It could be promoting dwelling. It could be promoting slowing down. It could critically be promoting the value of place to people, which I think is something we've lost as a geographer. We've lost the art of building places. That's really critical. Thirdly, symbolism. The state of public transport in the county and the country tells people everything they need to know about why they don't want to use it. So in Exeter, you've got these grubby bus stops kind of stuffed under sort of 1960s buildings. I don't drive, so I use the bus a lot. It's an awful place to wait. That tells people something. That symbolism is critical. And then their experience, as you were saying about bike lanes, people know that if they're trying to walk or cycle or to use public transport, they are in a minority in the sense that the majority who can afford it will be using individualised based transport, and their experience tells them that they kind of want to get out of that. So these are, I think, 4 key barriers that we really need to get to grips with.
I've got a car and I drive, but I also use the bus an awful lot. And one of the reasons I use the bus an awful lot is because I appreciate the nature of this emergency that we're in. And I think all of us around the table who have something to say about transport know inherently what the problems are, as we've articulately said this afternoon. And as I say, I was picked up something that Liz said, it was actually doing something about it is key now. And I think, going back to some of the points I was making earlier on about it's the politicians who have to actually deliver this kind of thing, I think one of the things that we can do is help those politicians get over one of the principal barriers which I think exists, which is their own misunderstanding of the problem. And often politicians will say, but I need to campaign for votes and that kind of thing. You don't have to do that. You can sit down and and find out what people think and then write about it in academic papers that no one will read. Well, in that case, then, perhaps it's our responsibility to get those academic papers that people don't read under their noses. And I've got in front of me here some work that was done by colleagues of ours, Gillian Annable and Stephen Stradling. And this was done back 15 years ago. And the work that Gillian did was really, to my mind, is really important, because what she said was she interviewed lots and lots of drivers, and she found that they were segmented. And some drivers are never going to give up their cars. They're always going to pick up the cars, they're petrol heads, whatever. Other people, Some of them really don't like using their cars but feel trapped into their cars because they're not aware of the opportunities that are actually available to them, such as the bus at the end of their road that goes directly to their office, and so on. So part of it's to do with helping politicians understand that actually not everyone is wedded to their car, and you can make perfectly good positive policy interventions, and 20% of drivers will thank you for it. And of course, once you remove 20% of drivers off the road, the buses become more punctual, etc., and you can go towards a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it's about helping people, helping politicians to help people help themselves, who want to help themselves, which is a really good start. I agree with the point about there are plenty of examples around Europe, and one of the things that you find when you look at them is that these were all difficult decisions that politicians had to make. They had to overcome the barriers. So the Netherlands didn't just become a cycling nirvana. It had to be made one, and politicians were very key in doing that. And I look at our own party, manifesto is here, delivering, the thing I'll finish on is devolution actually helps focus the minds. In London, one of the signature symbolic policy areas that the mayor can actually deliver on and be judged against his or her achievements is transport. And so what happens? It's become a very significant policy priority. In London, they're spending around about £1 billion on cycling improvements. In the Conservative Party manifesto here, I read that we will create a new £350 million cycling infrastructure for the entire country. Well, I mean, that's England, not the devolve. So things are a little bit out of whack. If you devolve to the local authorities things they could actually deliver on and really be held to accountable for, they'd be only too glad to show what they could do.
So just to clarify a point on that, John, Gillian Annabelle's evidence professor, Gillian Annabelle of the University of Leeds.
Gillian Annabelle, University of Leeds, yes.
Okay, barriers, I think, I'm not going to repeat a lot of things. One of the things about is just a misunderstanding of what shared mobility is. So I guess one of the things that we do, and I spend quite a bit of time with stakeholder innovation, is getting people on electric bikes, shared electric cars, and getting them to actually feel it themselves, because one of the best ways of learning is not just being talked to about it or reading a paper. There are lots of other ways, of course, of doing it, and that's really, really a learning that is really, really important, because that opens the barriers, I think, as well. And so those do lock. I think, and that's obviously what we do with people as well. We do pop-up, love your EV. So they just get to understand, and there's no one's been on an electric bike, you get on and go, wow, that's a whole difference. So there's a really good TED talk that says you've just got to hold a better gig than anybody else. So, you know, if you can get an electric car for £5, you can hire a bike for £1. Actually suddenly go, this is really good. Actually, I didn't realise it was going to be like this. So I think we really have got to paint a positive vision that's actually available now. And then it's sort of field of dreams, however you wish to do it, and say your neighbourhood could be this. I was involved recently in a planning application, and we did some consultation in a place in the southwest, and we talked to the local people who are really concerned about this development. There's going to be zero car. Electric bikes, electric cars, electric cargo bikes. And they were really concerned about it. A lot of feedback. And what they're actually interesting talks, they said you could tell that they actually quite like the idea of the whole shared mobility. They just thought these were people around and potentially who could join or who would become part of the development or would be close to it, but just didn't think it would happen. But actually you could see that they wanted it to happen. Just wouldn't, because there's, as you say, the symbolism around it is really, really important, I think. So I guess that's the other very practical thing, is actually getting shared electric bikes, shared electric cars onto streets, on public spaces. It's incredibly time-consuming, bureaucratic, takes a lot of time, commitment. There's a lot of people you have to judge, and that's what takes time. And that needs to be improved in sort of the gearing. It's very easy to put a space for something else, but it's very hard for something else to be involved in that electric infrastructure.
Okay. So it's been touched upon a fair bit, really, but really, for me, the big barrier is about getting real political will and support behind sustainable measures that are going to reduce congestion and improve air quality. This isn't just about will, this is about political backbone. This is also about perhaps an understanding or a redefinition of democracy, which was alluded to before, and the value of strategic need and how that is considered within democracy. And I can point to some horror stories of local politicians making decisions whereby Section 106 funding is handed back to developers because perhaps a couple of councillors feel that there shouldn't be a bus lane or even a bus service. I have examples from elsewhere in the country where a bus service has been withdrawn because for some reason the councillors have decided that it isn't needed. What happens to the money? It goes right back to the developers. And I will say this now, it's not a local authority in this region, just to say that, but I have an example of that. And so, what is democracy if you say decide that actually that bus lane there where someone parks in it every day cannot be decriminalised because the residents will complain and there's actually 10 houses that front this bus lane, but there's tens of thousands of people drive along that road every day and tens of thousands of bus passengers that travel down that road every day. So how do we define democracy in that particular instance? The development side of things is a really big issue, particularly in this region. Some fantastic development work and sustainable development work that is going on, and that needs to continue, but it's really difficult for the local authorities, it's really difficult for planning authorities to get the most and make development sustainable. The economics of developments, all developers, my perception is they play hardball. So how do we give local authorities the support to their officers in order to help them make difficult decisions against politicians that might be having their ears bent by other parties? You know, there's a whole landscape there that in many ways we need to sort of look into. But I think there's a bit of doom and gloom there, but there are big opportunities with, for me, young people and their attitudes, and you know, a lot of the political will I talk about there is potentially protecting the desire of individuals to park their car, drive their car, but young people are perhaps a bit more open-minded about other modes, about buses, trains, you know, bikes, and actually they're questioning, well, the private car, what is it to me today? The private car, you know, for decades has been a symbol of independence and freedom. Is it really such a symbol of freedom and independence now when it causes so much congestion and gridlock of our transport networks? And I think that that's up for grabs, and I think young people are potentially there to be mobilised as a greater voice.
Okay, I'll pick up on the electricity grid. We've spoken about Road to Zero and Road to Zero being EV focused, so I'm not going to go into sort of shared mobility and things, because we've been looking at that, and that's how we've been planning our grid. A lot of people that we found that have been looking at electric vehicles are thinking, well, what happens if how come I charge it? Will it charge? Will I get enough range? We did a project called Electric Nation, 700 electric vehicle users, biggest in the world when it started. We're really chuffed with the results of it. One thing it showed for us is that customers don't charge their cars every night, and they don't come home at tea time and plug them in. They charge them when it's cheap and when they need to. So 2 takeaways from our project was people will charge overnight if there's a tariff advantage, and people probably only charge every 4th or 5th day, and that's enough to give them 150-ish miles, a week's worth of energy. So from an electricity networks point of view, I'm not too worried about early adopters, especially because financially early adopters are the people that can afford to buy brand new cars, because that's the only EVs you can buy at the moment. They're likely to be people that have driveways and garages. Where I do worry is when EVs are more prevalent with other customers. So you've then got the question of, do you charge on the street or do you charge at your workplace or at your destination? We can come up with solutions for both of those. If it's workplace charging, we can install transformers like as if it was another office building to provide that capacity in the car park. For bus charging, you could provide a capacity as if the bus depot is a small factory. You know, that there's a lot. We're good at providing electricity; it's our job. So we can do that all over again for electric vehicles. But there are barriers. Barriers that you get when you talk to businesses are, I'm only the tenant of this office block. if I provide this capacity, it's the landlord that gets the benefit. So there's a whole sort of business development piece that has to come into here as well, in providing that capacity for those customers. And that's the side of the shared mobility and things. I think, but from an electricity point of view, we expect that we can provide capacity for people, and the scenarios that we have for the future look at the amount of extra capacity we need for electric vehicles and heat pumps and predict those into the network that we're building.
Thanks, Kerry. I'll just echo a couple of points that have already been raised. I think the just transition argument in terms of people that don't have off-street parking getting charged 35 pence a kilowatt hour compared to home charging where they get paid, well, they can pay 14 pence per kilowatt hour. That's not right. I think there needs to be something around that. There's Ohm EV have come out with a nice kind of roaming model with a smart charging cable where you could plug it in potentially a workplace and get your home tariff. That could be quite a nice solution. But even from a personal experience, trying to get workplace charging at our offices, it's a very interesting market at the moment. Just getting quotes. No, I'm okay with that. It's just getting kind of the diversity in quotes we got back. Dealing with the landlords, trying to get capacity. Even being reasonably technical, it was a difficult kind of market to navigate at the moment. And for early adopters maybe, but then as you say, making it a majority is going to be challenging. I think range anxiety is one issue, but charger anxiety is another. Is it reliable? Is there going to be a queue? Are there going to be other people there blocking my charging bay? I think there's definitely a work to be done on procurement in terms of looking at the operational costs, the OPEX rather than just the CAPEX of the kit, because I think that probably there's been a lot of learning over the last few years, but there are a lot of networks out there that potentially aren't as reliable as they should be, and there should be some action taken on some of those if they're not being reliable, because that's not good for anyone in terms of this transition. Vehicle choice, I think, is 2020 is going to be a real key year. I think there's going to be double the amount of battery electric vehicle cars coming out next year. The company car tax changes are going to be a real big driver. And I think there's something around, as you say, as soon as you try an EV, as Mark said, as soon as you try this technology, you love it. So something around free trials or reduced leasing costs for SMEs with fleets to try and get them to make the switch. Could be some options there to try and, as an opportunity to really build uptake in the area. Linked with shared mobility and shared car clubs as well, I think, obviously. Great.
So thank you very much, everyone. There's some really interesting barriers and opportunities coming out through that. I think what we're going to do now is we do have a short break scheduled. Kerry and I think during that break are going to go away and just consider some of the points. I don't think we've got time to run through everything. Just in that 10 minutes and think about how we want to take the next session. So really what we're looking to do after the break is actually have, and thank you for your patience as you sat around and listened to everyone talk, have a bit more of an interactive discussion in terms of what priorities for immediate action should be, noting, and other people have mentioned this, we are in an emergency and what we need to be doing now, acting as if we're actually in an emergency rather than business as usual. And how, and various other people have mentioned things as well, what funding mechanisms might exist and what can we do at the local level to enable us to get some of these immediate actions off the ground. I think pleasingly for me though, there's some really good recurring themes that have been coming through from this discussion already. So I think almost everyone around the table has mentioned the issue of spatial planning and how spatial planning and transport planning need to be joined up. You can't do one without the other. And sort of linked to that, interchanging as well. I hate the phrase interchanging because it's all about mobility, but interchanging between modes is a real key issue for us. And we need to have more mobility hubs where we don't see interchanging as something that penalises you as a user. You need to just be able to get to do that. There's been lots of, I think these are opportunities and sort of wider co-benefits that have come up around health and well-being, and I think that's a really great sell that we can make to people. And maybe, as Zsolt has said, maybe we're not very good at transport planners at doing that, and maybe we need some help. And I think quite interestingly from me, symbolism has been mentioned by both Stuart, Mark and Mike. in terms of actually conveying the message that we want to be out there. Let's have public transport that looks like it's fit for the 21st century, and that maybe will draw people in and get people out of their cars. There's a real interesting point around symbolism there as well. And yes, I think just a couple of points that Tim and Ollie have raised as well in terms of inequality in access to transportation, and actually how do we have a just transition to a mobile society that is fair for all. So thank you very much. There's some really interesting points coming up. If you want to add anything, Kerry?
I think, you've captured most of my key points. I think the symbolism point was really interesting. Actually, I would add safety into that, the perceived safety around public transport. So particularly often being a lone female, I don't always feel safe around travelling on buses late at night and trains, and whether that's a perceived issue or a real one, if we are going to move this forward, that issue needs to be gone. The other key thing was the link with the spatial planning, and I guess I hadn't really ever considered the issue of neighbourhoods that you only live out in, you have to commute into to get your shopping and your healthcare and your work, and of course it makes sense that should be joined up. So I think we're touching on some really important issues, and it's great that they're the same ones coming up. So please grab some coffee. We're going to try and work out a structure for the discussion for the next session, and we'll see you back at this table in 10 minutes' time. That's right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we just? Yeah, I'll turn it off.
Yeah, no, I think.
Yeah, if you want to. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, then thank you. And sorry, it's a slightly reduced break. We've got quite a lot to cover in this next session. So Nick and I have allowed an hour for this discussion. And as he said just before the break, we want this to be a bit more of an open dialogue. We need to try and identify out of that long list of actions that we've just come up with and the associated issues with those, we need to put a time frame on how we go about prioritising these. So we would like you to consider a time frame broken down into, and this is how we think it should work. We're open to criticism or suggestion, but we'd like to break this down into actions that are in the immediate term. So we're thinking in the next year to 5 years, but ideally closer to the year point, then out to the end of 2032, and then out to 2050, fully expecting that the answer of 2050 is far too late. So we're expecting everything to be in much before that. So think about the time frame that these actions need to be dealt with in. Also then consider at what level we're looking at them. So is it on a Devon level? Is it something that we should be doing within the county? Or is it something that we should be pushing for national government with, or both? And then how is it going to be funded and how much is it going to cost? So just some really easy questions for a Tuesday afternoon. So if we can just solve that in the next hour, that would be great. So we're not going to do this as a round table because I think you've all been very well behaved and a bit of free rein now to, we'll still have to use the mic, so we will still have to pass the mic around. But I'd like to throw it open really to pick up on some of the key themes. Well, if we pick up on the key themes now and then we'll throw it open. So I'll pass back to Nick to pick a few key themes to start this with and hopefully it'll make sense.
Thank you. So just on that timescale that we've outlined, the reason that 2032 is in there as a slight odd date is that that's the end of the next carbon budget. So the Committee on Climate Change has noted that we are not on track to meet carbon budget for. And I think that really ties in quite neatly with one of these recurring themes around spatial planning. It takes policy an awful long time to come to fruition. And I think that's really something that we need to concentrate on. So I think just looking through this in terms of the key themes and immediacy, there was a lot that was talked about in terms of symbolism to start with. And I wonder if there is some quick wins that could be done now that actually promote public transport, getting us out of our cars as a community and something that we can kick off on. So I don't know if anyone was willing to take that challenge up.
I would also, I'd just add on, I think I'm taking symbolism a little bit more broadly as well, with adding into that the engagement piece around and the education as well. So the perceived misconceptions around the shared transport model and electric vehicles. So symbolism kind of in the whole.
Feels a bit like what most of us probably do if you're in a practitioner's role every day anyway. Trying to make it more attractive, trying to tweak around the margins. Personally, I think we need to maybe, if we're looking at all of these things, think about the stuff that's going to achieve a real big shift a bit more quickly. So I think there is that symbolism role to do, but I think we personally think we should focus on what sticks we could actually introduce to actually really fast track some behaviour change.
So just going to one thing, we're clearly in a climate emergency.
Yeah.
Emergency should mean that we toss business as usual out of the window potentially.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's worth reflecting on that.
If we were the cabinet office going, how are we going to get this solved really quickly? It's not the bus stops are a bit mucky. It's, it's workplace parking levies. It's one way. It's modal filters. It's placemaking. It's lots of things like that. So I guess maybe each topic, it's going, which one is actually going to go and fast track things.
So I think yes, as part of the session, feel free to. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I think feel free to be quite forward, and if it is very business as usual, let's do it.
Okay, I'll rise to the challenge. I'll just focus on two spatial scales as a geographer. The first we haven't really talked about too much really, which is aviation, but we do have an airport obviously within Devon at Exeter. So just some thinking about how we tax aviation and how we tax passengers would be a good start. You could think about moving to tax the plane to make sure that planes are as full as possible to make them more efficient, or you could tax the passenger more aggressively. So, for example, everybody might get a limit of one round, the equivalent of one short-haul round trip a year available to them. And after that, they pay a very steeply increasing rate of tax. So on your second short haul, you pay twice the amount of tax. On your third short haul, you pay 4 times the amount of tax. On your fourth short haul, you pay 10 times the amount of tax, etc., etc. And all of that would be relatively easy to do because of the databases that airlines have when we book flights. The second one, so local, in terms of local transport, buses. I think buses are the best way of getting the quickest win in terms of a lot of sustainable urban journeys for those which can't be walked or cycled. Other people will pick up walking and cycling, and particularly in terms of placemaking. But I'll just go on buses, because I can lob in a hand grenade straight away on this one, and I can give you an easy way of raising the money for it too. So I would remove free travel for pensioners. And I'd do it straight away. And the reason I'd do it is because I think it's a gross distortion of subsidy. I think it's perfectly possible to give people who are of pensionable age very discounted travel, for example, a 50p flat fare. And then we could redirect some of the, and I quote from the Department for Transport's figures, which I just looked up during the break, £1.12 billion we spend every year in England alone giving old age pensioners free travel. Now, I'm looking at my learned colleague here from Stagecoach, and I'm sure if Richard Stevens from Citybus were here, he'd tell you the same thing. Well, I shouldn't put words in his mouth, but if all of a sudden we charge 50p per flat fare per journey, so £1 return anywhere, that's not bad, you'd free up hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds at a stroke, which could immediately be invested into bus transport infrastructure in all of our towns and cities for the benefit of everybody who uses the buses. So that would mean an end to grotty old shelters. It would mean huge investments in real-time information, in interoperable ticketing, in subsidies for the companies to invest in even better buses than they already have done. It would mean huge investment in bus priority networks across our cities, because some of the money could be spent on some road allocation to get motorists on board. And then the 20% or so of motorists we mentioned earlier on who really want to switch to buses would do. It would be a really good shot in the arm to do something very quickly about our urban transport problem and address some of the issues that we've been talking about around the table. And it's entirely fundable with money we already spend, so there's no need for any new budget at all. But in times for an emergency, I think it's time that we re-evaluated whether or not giving people of pensionable age free travel, when actually there's a societal need for that subsidy to be much more justly distributed across everybody, including the young, the unemployed, and so on. That might be a good start.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting point. I think a subsidy. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, the way we sort of see it, we see it as a payment for the carriage of a person, and then we essentially get half the average fare, and that's, you know, there's been arguments within our industry about whether or not that economically does genuinely recompense us for that journey. The wider argument for me is something to really be considered here, which is the wider value of the economic value of that journey made, and whether the subsidy represents good value. Now, you're presenting a point which is very much the opportunity cost of that subsidy or payment that could be reallocated elsewhere, and that's essentially that's an important evaluation. But the amount of money spent by a bus passenger in a local centre, I think Greener Journeys put it down to about £27 per passenger. So if you look at the generation that has taken place as a result of free travel for all the elderly, it's got quite a significant price tag attached to it, to the local economy, and there's very local economies that may even suffer as a result. So it's something that I think it's right to challenge and question, but it's something that also you've got to be very careful in terms of the fabric of the economic value of that sort of ball. So the impact on the cost base of what is then left, and then, you know, does the subsidy then, what does the payment then go into? 1.2 billion over the country. the London bus network alone operates as a £700 million deficit. So that 1.2 billion over the rest of England and Wales how far does that actually go? So then you have to think, well, where does that go? And then in one area they might say, well, we want it on infrastructure, but what's the cost benefit ratio of putting it in infrastructure? So it's a really difficult decision to make that, and that sounds quite a political answer actually, but I think that's probably where the politicians have got to as well, though. It's a difficult fabric to dismantle.
Just come back on one point on that, but that'd be right. I agree, it is a difficult decision, and there is clearly an evaluation to be made there. The one thing I'd make is if you look at bus patronage in England outside of London, it's now in decline again, and that includes all of the journeys that older people are making. What I think that I'd like to propose here is a redirection of public investment into infrastructure, which allows the bus companies to make much better use of it to arrest that decline and then increase by 50%, double whatever the patronage from all cross-section of society, which hopefully would reinvigorate those town centre losses from possibly fewer journeys from older people. But
can I? Right. Okay. There we go.
Yeah, not directly related to the bus subsidy, but I think it's an interesting point that we commissioned some economic analysis and actually calculate that across the Greater Exeter region, the private individuals are spending around £450 million every year on fuel for their cars. And if you add on top of that what they're then paying in terms of road tax and parking charges and all of the other charges, maintenance and servicing, that's an enormous amount of money that ordinary everyday people are spending. And if given time and given the right kind of projects, that is a huge amount of money that could be redirected into funding more shared and active travel schemes. And I think that's just an important point. But bringing it back in terms of symbolism and whether that's symbolism in terms of the buses, I think one of the key things that we ought to be looking to do is designating an area, either a particular route, so maybe Newton Abbot to Exeter or Plymouth to Ivy Bridge, or maybe it's Exeter itself, or is it a particular ward in Exeter to be used almost as a pilot, with a very strong narrative engaging the local businesses and residents there who are comfortable and supported to just try stuff. So not spending 6 months doing options analysis and taking different papers to consultation, but actually just designating that area to be used as a pilot, and then find out what goes wrong, what doesn't work, what do people not like, who's not being represented, who's not being picked up, and actually, really understanding what the challenges are. And I think it's practical action. It is the most symbolic thing that we can do at the moment.
Thank you. So just coming back on a couple of those points, it would be useful to know, in terms of the actors, clearly Devon doesn't have a lot of control over the bus, and what we're talking around here with potentially the pensionable, sort of the reduced fare going away would need to be done at the national level. So it'd be interesting to understand your thoughts on what Devon could do and where we should be lobbying as well, and how immediate this action should be. How quickly do you think that could come in terms of time frame, both in terms, Liz, of your trial, but also in terms of what John's talking about?
In terms of trials, I think, I could boldly say that Exeter would be happy to act as a pilot for some of these mobility schemes. We do have projects such as the Sport England local delivery pilot, and also quite a lot of political will. But obviously, we'd have to find the right wards and the right people to do that. I would hope, given this is an emergency, that with the people involved within the projects and the activities we've got, we could select a route or a particular ward or a bunch of people to just crack on and try stuff almost immediately. Exeter itself aren't Transport Authority, so we would have to work very closely with our partners in Devon County, and through Exeter City Futures we have that partnership in place already. I would like to be doing it by January, but whether or not that's possible, we aim to have our carbon neutral roadmap in place, understanding our own barriers and resource requirements in Exeter by March. So I would hope that at that point we would be able to have committed to 1 or 2 emblematic or symbolic projects.
I think I would support that, actually. You mentioned Devon doesn't have any control over bus service, but what it does have is a lot of influence. We consider them to be our partners, and we allow them to influence our network. And you know, it's something that actually works very well for us both as partners. I think Exeter City Futures has an excellent vision, and I think what that does make it quite a good opportunity to have a study area and perhaps move forward there.
I think it kind of coming back to kind of easy wins, and I think there's a lot of policy in place at the moment. I feel we're very much moving from a carrot to a stick environment in a lot of sort of energy related areas, generally because I guess there's not funding available, and there is already quite a lot in place, not all of it particularly brilliant, but again with energy assessing of businesses and houses, and I would have thought that there's probably quite an easy win to include the travel side of things within a business, and a requirement for, I think someone mentioned it earlier, for businesses to show their staff of what options might be available. And you know, we certainly know it from our own premises. Our previous premises, we were in Marsh Barton. It was quite easy to get to, but we didn't have any sort of showering or changing facilities, and it was actually quite hard to get people to cycle to work, even though it's quite good transport. Marsh Barton is a nightmare to get in and out of in a car. We've moved premises. We now have showering and cycle and much better bike parking facilities, and we have a much higher proportion of people now cycling to work. Even though we're now out of Exeter, it's harder to get to some big hills, but people are making use of it. So I think providing facilities for people and having that, ensuring that businesses are providing information, and I think starting very early on by just giving them essentially as part of a kind of induction what options there are to get to work and back. But then that obviously then being used as a sort of platform to start pushing through some policies of having a requirement for businesses to provide facilities for people to use low carbon transport to get to work and back, because I don't think without that kind of stick it's not going to happen.
I think, personally, having been in that kind of field, I think you've got to add some kind of fiscal disincentive. County Hall, one of the first employers in the city to introduce workplace parking charging, the funding from that was ring-fenced to sustainable transport measures, so all staff at the county council get 50% off the bus fares. It paid for new showers, paid for new lockers, paid for the co-bike dock, electric vehicles, and actually if people can see, so Nottingham as scaling that up to a city scale, and actually that could be delivered relatively quickly. Have the politicians got the chilies to stand by that? Basically, you'd have to do some numbers in terms of what's the parking stock in the city to see if it could work, but actually something like that, it's that combination of we've put all of the nice things in, and yes, you're going to be charged to park, but what you get back in return. There are 8,500
car parking spaces in Exeter City Centre.
There you go. So, sticking with the fiscal, I do think that behaviour change is kind of founded on that fiscal sort of side of things, and you've got the opportunity of reinvestment, both at a national level and locally. I partially agree with the free older people. I think there's if there's £30 billion rating to be spent on increasing the size of the road network in this country, let's stop that, halt that immediately, and actually spend that on local transport rather than trying to get people to travel from city to city. North Tyneside are doing exactly this. They will not accept new developments if it exceeds the capacity of the existing road network in the area. And I think that's something that Devon could be looking at. Workplace parking levy, fully support that. when is UK's first low carbon or climate emergency congestion charge going to come in a city? That's something that I think is waiting to happen, and it's becoming much more normalised now with low emission zones and clean air zones to do that sort of thing. In Cambridge, just one example of a development, Erdington, you don't get a free parking space. You have to spend £85 per month if you want a parking space. It's got great public transport links, it's got good cycling links, but this isn't a new development in the city centre of Cambridge. This is on the outskirts. It shows that people are attracted to that sort of development if it's done in the right way. Ghent, on the 24th of April 2017, they blocked 4 key roads into the city centre. Overnight, traffic declined by 16%. Public transport increased, cycling increased. And I was there 2 days ago, and you can now walk around the city centre in the afternoon, and all you can hear is kids playing in the playground. It's lovely, but it can be done with that political appetite. The only other one that I really want to highlight is Copenhagen are aiming for 2025 carbon neutral. They are looking at free public transport from the suburbs for rail as well as bus, because that's where the only people that still drive in Copenhagen come from. And I would argue that the reason that Copenhagen can do that and London potentially can't is because Copenhagen has a 62% modal share of internal journeys by cycle. London, it's all on public transport. The maintenance, operation, costs of public transport are huge in comparison to cycling. So if you can get the cycling right at a city scale, which we've got experience way back in the past from, we can save a huge amounts that then can be ploughed into all of these other activities and making the public transport offer far more attractive and viable.
I just want to build on what you were saying about planning. So I do think a key action should be that particularly the district authorities that have responsibility for planning, permission, development control, they do have a lot of power, although I know from speaking to a lot of the planners in those authorities in the county that they are perpetually frustrated with the appeals system, which obviously operates at the national level. But there are examples that you've given us from other parts of the UK where that power can be exercised, and I would say in an emergency that the county should help those district authorities in that way. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. Multimodal, I think, is really important. When we did a piece of research 3 years ago now with the City Council in Exeter, the County Council and 4 commercial companies that were interested in kind of smart transport, we realised that the number of people that we surveyed who were using more than one mode of transport to get to and from work each day. So, for example, building on what John's suggesting about kind of investing in infrastructure, why can't we just have 2 bike spaces on every bus? Every bus has 2 bike spaces. Metropolitan Vancouver, every single bus vehicle has 2 bike spaces. I mean, it's a rack on the front, it's not a space in the bus. Seattle in the States. Now, the symbolism of that is really important. But actually, the practicality of it is that means that in a kind of, Seattle, Vancouver, a very similar climate to Devon, you might cycle to work in the sun and it'll be teeming down with rain in the evening. You just put your bike on the bike rack and off you go on the bus because you don't want to get wet on the way home. It offers that flexibility. And that gets to my third point, is the research that we did. What we were interested in is what John picked up in that paper from Gillian Annabel and colleagues, was this idea of segmentation. And we picked up that there are people who are car drivers, but many of them are car drivers for 18 out of 20 working days in a month. And for the other 2 working days, they cycle or they walk or they take the bus. So the question is then, how do you get those people to take the bus or to cycle or to walk 3 or 4 or 5 days in a month? And actually, some of the things that we found that were really important were levels of certainty about public transport reliability, weather forecasting, really significant. Now, we are beginning to be in a position where we have such a huge amount of data that will enable people to make those decisions, that what I think we need to do, that this is a county thing, you could feasibly begin to think about producing some kind of information app for those people who use smartphones that could give them that level of integrated, reliable information. I know there are various, real-time apps for public transport and so on, but actually a county badge, this is a symbol of how much we care about this, that we're going to make this something that we're going to start integrating bus, rail, cycling, weather information. I think that as a short-term goal could be quite interesting.
Just to pick up on a couple of themes there. The first and last mile is a real issue for public transport and a barrier for public transport use, particularly when you've got significant rural hinterland like in Devon. And you mentioned the cycling bus thing is really interesting, because in Scotland I've seen very successfully, just in the middle of nowhere, but at a key bus, just at a bus stop in the middle of nowhere, a bike rack, a covered bike rack, or lockers. And this is in very rural areas, but people use them because they might live in a house or a village that's a mile away from the bus route. But because they've got a bike, it's only going to take them 5 minutes to actually get there. And I think that's something that potentially we could pursue in Devon. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a good example actually. Devon did fit out 35 buses with Stagecoach about 10 years ago with bike racks, but then the drivers' unions got involved and they refused to. So the project never got anywhere. But so it's interesting. It's the same with some of the bike bus things. There's been 4 or 5 projects that actually the county. I found some of the authorities have this institutional amnesia of things we've tried and kind of somebody's left and it's in a cupboard under there. It's like, actually, didn't we do a bike bus once? And I mean, again, this was kind of just as I was starting in Devon, so I'd have to delve back into some old desktop that's probably, got to wind up in the corner. But I think, all of those, these are all those little bits and pieces. But I guess again, I'd bring it back to that kind of bus, cycle parking at bus stops. Great in terms of that multimodality. And, I know in the Netherlands, I think it's the fastest growing form of transport is bike and train integration. So you've got that. And so they're starting to see them as one thing. And I think that's where there is some mileage, but how much in terms of if you start every sentence with, in an emergency, I don't know, it's just, sorry, pass it on.
Yeah, in response to the emergency, so we've got a new draft transport strategy for Exeter, within which there's about 100 measures for the next 10 years. We've stalled adoption whilst we do some further work on analysing the carbon impacts of those different measures. We're getting to the point where we'll have a clear list of which the biggest measures or the biggest wins are, and a lot of those are schemes that promote sustainable modes and include highway space reallocation. But the challenge I always see is delivering them quicker. We touched on it earlier about the trials and the reverse. I'd say it's almost reverse consultation. There's some schemes. There's one in the city centre at the moment. We're about to make a road permanently one way, but it's on the back of it being one way for construction. And I'm pretty confident if we consulted before any changes, we'd have got majority objection. But actually, when it's in place, people do it, pro it. So I guess for me, it's how we can roll out trials in a faster manner. We traditionally do option development. Actually, is there a way to crowdsource information? So our cycle parking for the city and modal filters we're looking at is crowdsource data from Cycle Campaign and others members of the public. Is there a way we can crowdsource designs for certain areas, and then a way to trial them quicker? One thing, this is probably a slightly separate point we hadn't picked up on. I might be in the minority, inspired by events in politics at the moment, and I'd be wary to say too much because we're in, because we're in Purda, so I can't say too much. But one thing that comes clear, we touched on the politics behind it and getting people to buy into making these decisions, is that TV, they have a lot of political analysts, but it does strike me there's a role there that we don't we do a lot of work which is evidence-based of where on transport basis the best place to do schemes is. We don't do anything which is politically, these are the areas we think it would be easiest to implement measures, which I think actually, if you're after quick wins or finding places to make changes, that's something we could do. In Exeter on a whole, I see it's easier because we're at a point where the majority of people who live in Exeter don't drive to work, so that's a positive. But some political analysis would be quite quick to do, and I think, we're a tendency for practitioners to talk in transport speak rather than to a politician, rather than speaking to a politician in terms of politically, this is the best area or this is where things sit politically for what you could do, and that I think would be a quick win.
I guess pretty much what I would say, if we're talking 1 to 5 years, and obviously I'd say there needs to be just a lot more faster growth in shared mobility. We're being up to 50 cars next year, and that's above the national average for what it should be, theoretically, for shared cars. And I say because we've got the demand, because you create the space and you create the conversation, then there's there. I get every week, I've got towns around the southwest wanting shared cars. Every week I get developers coming to talk to me. I think it's a total misunderstanding that actually there's a lot of will and interest in this, both from an economic perspective, both from a land use space, and also from a climate emergency space. But actually the response to that is very hard, both in terms of being able to work with whichever the local authority is to provide the provision, trying to work out what the business model be, trying to understand, but we're a not-for-profit cooperative, so we can do things like local cooperatives and work with them, etc. There are lots of different ways we can look at the business model. We shouldn't just think it should be through a commercial lens. I think it's really important that we should throw out the business model, think about something as a service, think about how we amortize the different capital assets. There are lots of different ways we could look at different business models that could then actually utilize some of the capability, either whether it's cheap leasing or lending from local authorities, or it's actually other markets. There's also a lot of interest in terms of obviously EV rollout, so we're also thinking, okay, we're working with providers that can actually provide services to us, but because they can see that the land availability in the future will provide a lot of electric charging capability, they may well say, okay, great, you're a base load. As an electric car club, you're a base load. That's great, because you're ahead of the curve to the actual next EVs. So I think we need to sort of put up old business models, throw them out the window, and start really think about how this could be provided much faster, because I think there is a latent demand. I also would say, electric bikes are totally, a lot of people perceive electric bikes are great. It's good for people who, are a bit old, or, oh, that's good, they're not really very good, you're not very fit or whatever. No, the perception from people is actually, oh, look, I'm a normal person, I can cycle a bike. No, not rather than, oh, these bike lanes are just for fast people who've got, fast bikes, etc. Bikes are then for everybody, and that really changes the conversation. So again, back to this vision and conversation, it's really important. And then suddenly go, oh, great, and so it is a car alternative. Our electric bikes use double the length than a normal bike would be, because people can go further. They can go the trips, they can have quieter, so you're making up for some of the lack of safety and provision by providing electric bikes. Ideally, we'd have fantastic superhighways everywhere, in Plymouth, in Exeter, all over the place. We don't have that, but there are ways around that. And I guess our last point would be the last mile. Buses, absolutely. Mass transit is by far the most efficient way of moving people around. But people want to go to particular destinations and they spot around. And so getting bikes provide that, whether it's their own bike or integration closely with a bus, I think is really, really important, because then you can begin to, again, I'm going to backstate, you've just got to hold a great gig. Our bikes are deliberately designed and our colours are deliberately designed to look modern, attractive, interesting, exciting. Our demographic was from 21 to, well, orange and white. Yeah, but not black. Can I just make that comment? Not dark colours. So be exciting. Orange is an appealing colour. And I'm not a transport planner, just like to say that. So, more of a marketeer, and that's what we need to do more of.
Yeah, firstly, just like to echo a couple of points. Completely agreed on the work-based charging levy. I think we need ambition there. Frequent flyer levy, I'm all for that. I think that these are two really accessible forms of value. Contentious, definitely, but I think in an emergency, need to be contentious, need to be disruptive, need to push the boat out a little bit more. And just finally, I think we talked about workplace charging already, but I think there's something to do around stimulating workplaces, be that Devon County Council, be that other local authorities, be that big fleets in the county, to look at workplace options, workplace charging solutions. That might just be signposting, but ideally some form of free trials, support and grant funding around that, in order to get reduced leasing costs or support towards leasing costs, for them to just give them a go, and as soon as they've got them, I think they'll love them and use them more. Simple as that.
If I could just add one more point, picking up around Will's points about crowdsourcing designs and consultation, and also about building cooperatives. I think there is an immediate need for support to be provided to local communities to help enable them with the right skills for them to think about the kinds of solutions and responses that work for their community. What are the problems and the challenges that they have? Whether there's a high percentage of people living that have disabilities or particularly low incomes or can't access certain services. You know, what options have they got to build social enterprises and models that help them respond, and what support can Devon as a county provide to help them access innovation and build those solutions that will work for them?
I'm curious about the non-business model, certainly the voluntary sector for older people getting to health appointments, because the business model just doesn't work. So I would be very interested chatting to Ollie about things that are happening in Cornwall. And yeah, it might be interesting to see how electric cars volunteers from a place to a place where the range is reasonable to start with. I think that would be quite good at a very small level to look at and work at, but to see how the non-business model would work.
One of the things, it's interesting with the camera there, I guess I suddenly think about who pays my wages at the moment. What can I say? What ideas have come down from the top that I'm allowed to say? And I think actually, I was mentioning to somebody earlier, there's lots of young fresh blood coming out of university, doing their masters in transport planning, or whatever it might be, whatever subject is. How do we enable this kind of widen the discussion? So there's ideas. I know City Futures have been doing that on a city level, but institutionally as well, you know, within council structures, how do you allow those young people to come up and go, actually, I've got an idea, and not feel like you have to wait till you're 30 before you develop your voice and want to interrupt the manager. Well, yeah, 40, yeah, exactly. No, exactly, but you know, then you develop your voice between 20 and 30. Then you start actually thinking about what you're saying, or not, or not. Let the coffee do the talking. Sorry, but it's how you encourage that, and I think organisations can do that. There was I think it's Thomas Pink video that said, you know, Google or somebody one day a month they let their staff do something different, and those ideas then get fed back into developing. I'm not, you know, that would be impossible with the council because everybody say, you know, you're letting your officers go on holiday for a day or something. But how do you give people that time, that mental bandwidth to say, come up with some ideas, bring some fresh innovation to this?
No, did you going down that end? Somebody down that end?
I was just going to say, wait till you're 56.
I guess I'm conscious of time, and this is a really interesting discussion. One of the key things I took from the first couple of sessions is everybody was in agreement that ideally we need to reduce the amount of transport that people are doing and change the way they're doing it. And I think we've covered quite a lot of that, but we haven't really touched on the electric vehicle point too much during that discussion, and the issue of infrastructure and where it's placed, and how we go about building a network of infrastructure, of charging points that actually then enables that third bit where we haven't been able to stop people travelling, and we haven't been able to get them to do it on buses and public transport. So I guess I'm keen. We've got quite a few people in the room that are here from that side of things. So I guess I'm keen to hear around where we'd put priorities, who's paying for it, and is it national or local. So I'm going to go to Gabriel. Oh, going to Nick first.
Sorry, just one thing. I think yeah, that's absolutely right. We should be picking up on that. I think noting the fact that we're in a climate emergency, and I think people probably saw in the papers last week that a number of scientists now are saying that we've actually hit some of those tipping points in the climate that ultimately we do not want to be hitting, because that's when we start getting into these feedback loops which really start tripping us over. So whilst I think we do need a vision for travel, we do need, if EV is a way of decarbonising as quickly as possible, then yes, that's exactly, we do need to be talking about that.
Okay, so I guess from like experience of driving electric vehicles for a while and running sort of electric vehicles for work, is one of the key things with the infrastructure is, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the existing infrastructure, is especially public infrastructure, is pretty poor and unreliable. So what you find is if you're trying to plan a trip using the sort of publicly open charge points, it doesn't always go to plan, and you only need that to happen once or twice to really have quite a bad opinion of how it works. So unfortunately the simple answer to that is everyone needs to buy a Tesla, and then it does work and it's fine. But it does show. Yeah, well, exactly. That's the problem. But I guess the problem is, those Tesla superchargers cost around about £50,000 to put in each, and so that's where it comes back to. The Tesla cars are expensive. They are getting cheaper, and they will continue to get cheaper. But those superchargers are very expensive to put in compared to a standard charger, or even a lower rate sort of rapid charger. So it all comes down to, okay, so if it's an emergency, you have to do something, you're going to have to spend money. That's what you do. You put in better quality, higher volume of charging infrastructure, which I'm guessing you can do. There's lots of people, I'm sure, around the table who understand where those transport routes are. What are the trips that are people doing? Where do they need that charging infrastructure to allow them to make their journeys? Personally, from our experience, myself and my colleagues very rarely use public charge points. We tend to use them as a top-up because they're free and they're nice in some places, but you very rarely actually plan a trip. And when of all the trips that I take, it's very rare that I plan to use a charger on the way to use it. But again, it's different for each person. So the real kind of key is I think having the ability to charge at home and being able to charge at work. And I think if you can, Devon County Council can lead by example, for instance, having the staff at schools, hospitals, all your sort of council offices ensuring that there is the infrastructure there that people can use. That's one thing that's under your control that I'm sure you can do. But then, as I say, I think ensuring that you have a policy that essentially is a stick that is essentially forcing people to put infrastructure in place, because otherwise I don't think it will happen. It won't happen because there is no financially attractive reason why companies would put workplace charging in for their staff. It's a huge cost. It's complex. It disrupts, and also it gives it leaves them with an ongoing higher cost when a lot of their targets of reducing carbon. If you suddenly take a fuel cost, which was your staff's problem, and suddenly put it on your company's books, you've incurred another issue. So I don't think it will happen unless there is a policy framework. But if the funds are there, technically it's all possible. It's just a challenge. And then, sorry, just the other thing, I think that the on-street charging, there's a lot of people who will want to, a lot of the benefits are from charging from off-peak, charging from solar, and so having on-street charging, having an ability to be able to basically run a cable essentially and having a space reserved outside your house is something, it's a challenge, but I think if you did that, that would again enable a lot of people who are at the moment completely out of the market to take that move into electric vehicles. So I don't know exactly what the policy is for running cables across pavements, but essentially there must be a physical solution to do that, and that would open up a lot of opportunity.
Pedestrian lobby.
How could you say? No, I was actually going to. So EVs, we support them, but I think there are some fundamental issues that we need to get right. The first is very much on the inequality side. They're expensive. The price is unlikely to fall that much. We need to make sure that we're not widening the social inequalities around access to everyday places, especially from poorer, more deprived neighbourhoods that tend to be further away from public transport links, further away from everyday services and amenities. So that absolutely needs to be some sort of scheme that supports poorer people to access EVs alongside some of the challenges around the infrastructure that will come naturally with that in terms of houses of multiple occupancy, less parking, etc. Scrappage as well. We have a tendency to focus on scrappage schemes and bring in all these new cars. We're currently going through that of air quality. We might see it with EV as well. Where do these older cars end up? You're just shunting the problem down to other countries, to Eastern Europe, etc. And I think that's a massive issue we need to get right if we're talking about climate change rather than just Devon's contribution to the climate emergency. Pavement, obviously, massive issue. I live in a terraced houses. There's no, reserved parking space. The only place that I could see you could put charging points is on the pavement. Our pavements are probably about a metre width at the most. It's not big enough for a double buggy. It's not what is commonplace standards for walking, and it just creates more hassle and less attractive places for many people, especially the most vulnerable. EVs as well. We always talk about EVs, and it goes back to the cars thing. It's not just about electric bikes, electric cycles. Logistics in a city is a huge proportion of transport. What are we doing to encourage more logistical last mile companies to actually be competitive? Zedify, originally from Cambridge, now operating in, I think, about 15 or 16 different cities across the UK, are doing this the hard way and showing that you can use electric bikes and cycles and adapted cycles to make deliveries in a completely competitive way. They have fundamental issues in terms of, for example, council tendering processes that have been set up in this archaic way to suit vans and other transport mechanisms, but they're still trying to make it work, and there's a lot you can learn from them around. Just the fact that a lot of electric vehicles are mobility aids for people. But we still, again, so for example, Motability, the scheme will allow you to rent a scooter, it will allow you access to a car, but it doesn't cover bikes and cycles. Same with Blue Badge. Can we expand Blue Badge to include cycles? So you could actually cycle into a building and gain access, or have more security, because the security around electric cycles, adapted cycles, is a lot higher because of the costs for the individual with those.
Got a number of things. So we're involved in a project in Exeter with the off-street charging, which means that you have charging hubs in car parks. As quite rightly said, most people are only going to be charging their cars, especially as the batteries improve, once a week maybe, or maybe every 4 or 5 days, but as the battery sizing. So that gives you the capability of being able to charge your car in car parks, or some on-street hubs, some off-street hubs where you have charging. Plymouth are working on a similar project, slightly different solution, but they've got the similar sort of approach as well in terms of that. And there are many other examples around the UK of looking at car park charging or other to address with the off-street as well. But they all recognise the fact that you're not going to be always plugging your car in every day. So you all understand that, and it's about how do you do patterns of people coming in and charging and managing that as well. Obviously, I would say as well from an equality perspective, obviously you can just share a car, as I said before, and so you don't have to own it. There's that perspective as well. I think the other thing I was going to say, we run co-delivery, which is a last mile delivery network in Exeter, and there are other providers in Plymouth as well who do that as well, and around, so you've seen that a lot more, but we are often hampered by, as you say, procurement, or there aren't disincentives for the, shall we say, the other providers being around they're very easy to stop and park. We get in, we've got an electric trailer that can take it, that connects to the bike, that does 180 kilos. There are lots of different things you can do, but often you have to work against the lack of incentive, shall we say, and yet there's a lot of movement that could be taken out. Yeah, sure.
It's not about buses. It's just a theme there that I think is quite important. It's. Sorry, is there anybody It's just it's very quick about delivery, and you mentioned about Co-Bike's sort of delivery service, but Amazon deliveries and things like that, and the amount of pollution done by delivery vehicles. And do internet companies pick up on the externalities that they produce versus the high street that gets taxed and rated to the hilt? And I think there's a huge issue there.
Yeah, thanks. I was picking up earlier on the infrastructure. I think the Norwegian example is a very good one. They're about the most successful, aren't they, in terms of pickup of electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are absolutely great for all the reasons we've discussed as one part of a larger strategy. I think, with the exception of shared vehicles, bicycles and that kind of thing, there's still private transport. And so the bigger issue to me, particularly in urban areas, densely populated areas, is we're looking at mass volume transport. Public transport still retains, and of course that can electrify. That still retains an issue. And the other thing isn't, if we're looking at raising revenue to support further transport investment, we always need to be aware that the more electric vehicles there are, the fewer people that are paying petrol tax. And therefore that's a huge declining source of revenue. And then we need to work out how we're going to replace that. So the current thinking is, well, we'll be putting congestion charging or road user charging in, because that's the way to get that revenue back in. So electric vehicles are absolutely marvellous, but one part of a broader strategy which is capable of both dealing with the congestion issue and maintaining a revenue source.
Just very quickly, I think with electric, we need to be mindful that in urban areas, the emissions per household is about 40% of what it is in the districts. So in terms of Exeter and the districts around it. In rural areas, it's likely to be higher. And as a priority, we ought to be looking at electrifying in rural areas where they have the biggest carbon footprint per household, which probably hasn't been the approach to date. Can't remember.
One more point. Can I just add one more point about a couple of people have said procurement, and I think earlier on we talked about the culture and appetite for taking risk, and we also talked about the needing to move beyond business as usual processes, and I think there is an immediate need for an overhaul in the way that the public sector procure. That there is no space, or certainly very little space, within current public sector procurement for the new kinds of innovations and technologies and the new products and services that we will no doubt need to achieve mass decarbonisation. There is no reason why public sector procurement can preclude these kind of innovative services. It chooses to do so. We have just mobilised a challenge-based procurement process with the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. It went through all the European tender standards. It was advertised on all of the external European compliant portals, and it was procuring against a challenge with no fixed specification. And it was only open to companies with a new and innovative solution. Now, if they can do that in the police, we can do that as a public sector. And I think that is something we could move on, starting to do from Monday.
Thank you. So just on that, we have a summary hearing on the 11th of December, where one of the cross-cutting themes that we'll be exploring, along with spatial planning and behaviour change in the more rounded form, not just mobility, is procurement. So if you want to come along to that, please feel free to come along and we can. But yes, we're certainly acutely aware of that as an issue. I think just coming back on the EV point, I'm conscious that of all of the discussion that we're having around visioning, I think we're just conscious that EVs are a part of the solution. We're certainly not, by having a fixed topic on it, saying that they are the solution, but we do need to tease out some of the issues around it. And whilst we have people in the room who can advise and provide good advice on that, but we are very conscious, and don't worry, we're not going down the strategy of wholly EV and just making sure we convert all vehicles that are currently on the road to EV and not trying to do anything else. One point I did just want to pick up on was one that Mike raised, actually, and we've not really had any discussion on it, is freight and the role of freight. So I think, as I said at the beginning, I think we've got around 15% of the makeup of emissions from the transport sector are for HGVs and 12% from LGVs. That LGV is growing incredibly rapidly with the rise of online deliveries, not just from your Amazons, other retailers are available, and supermarket shopping deliveries. And I think they're going to become an even greater source of not just emissions, but congestion as well. And it's a topic we've not really touched on. I don't know if anyone's got any comments on that. Go this way and then pass it to Will.
I just pick up on it not from an electricity network point of view, but from a fleet point of view for an electricity distributor. We've done some work in Nottingham to look at our fleet and how we could decarbonise it. And it's all to do with availability of vehicles. And to summarise Senex's research into a couple of sentences, which they'll hate me for, where we've got single operators working in small vans, we can decarbonise those and go electric tomorrow. Where we've got 2 operators working in a transit or larger with a lot of equipment, a lot of tools, flashing beacons, their power tools that need recharging, etc., it's very difficult and it needs the vehicles to be there. So I think back to your Amazon question, I don't know if there is a replacement for the transit yet, so maybe that becomes a stage 2 of what you do to move on.
Yeah, I think I was going to start with that. You know, delivery companies do get a bad rep, but I think we shouldn't forget it's a positive thing, really. Number of shopping trips per person has fallen by over 60 in the last 20 years. Some of that, depending on the estimates used, but around 50 to 60% has been replaced by deliveries, but it's still a net reduction, and ultimately people making shopping trips do it in a less efficient way than a company that is organising freight, which is in their interest to minimise the cost. So I think it's a positive. How you make it even better, I don't know the exact answer. I know in Exeter and actually I think across Devon we allow HGVs in our bus lanes. I don't know if that's universally popular with everyone, including the operators. But I think that's a positive for emissions. I don't know if we can explore doing something, allowing electric LGVs or something in there as well, but I'm aware it does have a knock-on impact potentially on buses as well.
Just on the LGVs, I remember I did a presentation earlier in the year about physical activity and, trying to promote active travel. And then we got to the point where I was thinking about it. Are people going to have to move at all anymore? They get their Dominoes delivered by a robot. Currently, it's a DPD van, and actually, we've got to look at some of the things like pavement parking. I'm only here for a minute, mate. And actually, are we supporting and pushing the legislation to ban pavement parking? I do get concerned about the rollout of EV charging points, with pavements being seen as the place for where to put them, because that's just car infrastructure creeping onto the increasingly small margin. So actually, should we be reallocating road space for where those EV charging points? So it's, pavements for people, not for quick drop-offs and EV charging infrastructure, however good that might be.
Just on LGVs, totally agree with some of the points already made. There's obviously been a lack of models available for LGVs. I think there was the last look at like one plug-in hybrid van that you can get. It's only just come onto the market, but there's lots more being planned over the last few years, and there's been a lack of supply really affecting uptake. Even if you want to get or decarbonise your fleet, you can't get the vehicles this year. And National Grid, Centrica are examples of who want to placed orders and actually not being able to get the vans that they want. So hopefully those supply issues might start being alleviated next year as some of the manufacturers kind of open up their supply chains, particularly around the EU fleet regulations on minimum carbon requirements on their fleets, so that will hopefully be sorted there. I was just going to touch on kind of the ultra-rapid charging hubs. There's obviously quite a few that are going to be quite critical, particularly for en route freight, potentially, maybe LGVs as well. I think there's a potentially a need to make sure those are future-proofed, to ensure that maybe if hydrogen's a better solution than electric, that there needs to be some kind of hydrogen charge infrastructure in there, green hydrogen, not just hydrogen. and linking with local supply of renewables wherever possible, and ensuring that those hubs are kind of good experiences, like Gloucester Services is a great example of a kind of a good experience for a ultra recharging hub might look like in the future. And then I suppose the roles of supermarkets, offering, some are starting to offer free charging, pulling people in, and that infrastructure needs to be included in any kind of charging infrastructure planning, because I think Morrison's in Devon alone the last 2 weeks have put 2 50 kilowatt charge points in some of their car parks. So there's a quick rapid uptake in those areas as well.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Just conscious of time, we've sort of overrun a bit. I think that's not a problem. What we were planning to do at the end, and I think we'll still go round and do now, is ask each of you, following this discussion, which I appreciate has been quite short, and I'm sure we could go on for much longer, and identify some key actions. We would like each of you to identify your top 3 actions that you think should be taken forward now. And I think combined with that, when you're identifying your top 3 actions, we would also, having judged where the decision has gone today, ask you to identify 1 priority action Devon should be looking to do, and a single priority action, if you could just take one of those forward.
And I think I'd just encourage you to stick to the actions. So we've identified lots of barriers and lots of things that opportunities and lots of things people could be doing. But from this, imagine that we've got to go away with Emily and the team at Devon and write this Devon Carbon Plan. What do you want to see reflected in there from just a purely action point of view that we will go forward and deliver? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to think that through, and then we'll pass the mic round. And I'm going to start the mic down this end this time.
I've written them down, so that's good. Okay. I'm worried the first one doesn't sound very exciting, but I haven't found a snappier way to say it, which is quite local authority, actually. But it is about delivering improvements to sustainable travel routes by reallocating road space, because I think it's a double win. You're improving things for active modes, but also reducing some highway capacity. Number 2 is part... Sorry. Improvements to active travel routes by reallocating road space. The second is linked to it, but I think it is its own standalone one, which is, I don't want to say process, but it probably is a way of rolling out trials and delivering changes in a faster manner. And that's going to be critical, particularly as the amount of construction skills is finite, and we're making changes on a wider scale. There's have to be a better way of doing it. And the third one would be electric shared mobility.
Sorry, Will, just your priority?
My priority, number 1.
This is really hard. Just 3. So I think there's got to be something over the long term around planning. And I'm not going to articulate this in the right way, but I think the local plans or strategic plans in Devon and in Exeter, Plymouth, etc., need to focus on how do we reduce car use, maximum rather than minimum, parking allowances. Guidance that says actually if you're going to build it here, it's just things that basically block car dependency for years to come. Secondly, I think there needs to be a real focus on ambitious fiscal incentives to generate a long-term local funding stream for walking, cycling and public transport that reduce car journeys, and there's probably more than one, depending on the situation. And the final one is very similar to yours, actually. It's the reallocation of road space for walking and cycling. But I think that costs a lot of money, so I think hand in hand with that is the use of filtered permeability, to really kind of reduce through traffic in local streets and open those up for people walking and cycling as well. Sorry, priority is probably number 2, the fiscal incentives.
Quickly, if you already agree with somebody else's, don't feel that you have to create another one. Any that we can put weight into is helpful, so feel free to back each other up.
Include transport planning in provision of health services. And I'm interested in looking at a volunteer electric car scheme. Priority is the planning to health services.
The fiscal one, which, what was your name? Tim mentioned. So it's creating a sustainable long-term revenue source for some of the things we've all talked about. The structural review within local authorities. So how does that emergency term filter down, as if you're playing that 80s game Downfall? What does it do? How does it filter through to make sure that everybody knows that it's all of their priorities? So what are they doing about it? And the third one is, don't forget Devon is rural. It's only because I'm sitting next to you, and it reminded me that I worked for the county council for a long time. But I think the first one, the fiscal, creating a long-term sustainable local revenue source to do all of these wonderful things, is the most important.
Okay, so 3 for me. Find a way that we can stop building houses predicated on personal car ownership, whether that's something we can do ourselves or whether we need to create a case and a lobby up nationally. We need to start setting up that thought leadership and doing what we can. The second, probably some weight towards one that Will had. Choose an emblematic project or a couple of exemplar project areas that we can deliver today, and to catalyse wider change, and to do that in a way that doesn't take eons of planning and a lot of money committed to something that we don't know works. So cones to segregate areas, or flower pots for filtered permeability. There's all sorts of stuff that we could just crack on with immediately without needing an enormous business case, and we need to choose an area for that. And the third one I'd like to see is around narratives and awareness. So programs of awareness of what's available and what choices people have got, what they can do already in terms of the things that exist in the city, and enable a forum for people to then feed back what they like and what they don't like and what they'd like to see. But I think my priority is to commit to those pilots immediately.
Yeah, I agree with Liz straight away. I think the first and easiest thing is, I think I've only mentioned 3 things the whole time I've been here. So the first thing I still think is just information. I think it's the easiest place to start. Give people that information, allow them to make choices so they can see what's right for them and what works for them. So whether that's people at home, but also kind of workplaces, the options they have, and try and do that in a way that's based on real evidence and not say manufacturers' claimed range, etc., like that. I think the second one is just about ensuring that there is a policy in place to ensure that people are being given options for workplace charging. I think that's a real key thing. And then I just think, again, Devon County Council leading by example by ensuring that you're doing and making the steps that you're asking other people to do. So, making sure that you're leading from the front and having the charging infrastructure and the education piece for all county council employees in place first.
And your priority?
Well, I just think the information thing is just that's the easiest win. So that's the one that you've got to get it right, but it's the least cost and potentially has the biggest benefit, because I just think a lot of people are just not sure what's possible.
I think I'll echo firstly the signposting and the support for workplace charging. I think that's crucial. I'll also go back to assessing the options for the frequent flyer levy and the workplace charging levy. I think we're going to need some sticks in order to push people to make the right choices potentially. And there's a lot of value there that could be used for shared mobility solutions, for spending on charge point infrastructure, whatever it may be. That value can be moved to other need it. And finally, just on rural charging infrastructure, I think there's going to be a lot of areas of Devon that no commercial model will work. So there is going to be a need for the council or some form of support to step in to provide that infrastructure, to allow businesses and homeowners and shared mobility solutions to access electric vehicles and electrification generally. I think, and if I was going to pick one, I think I'd pick the kind of fiscal incentives, the frequent flyer levy and workplace charging levy is a real crucial thing to look at and see what options there are for Devon to do.
Okay, picking one that is related to EVs, and I know we've spoken about whether or not people still use cars, but workplace charging, enough charging at workplace to stop people have the anxiety of not choosing an electric car in the first place. And that might need money spent on it because it's an expensive provision for people. Taking it away from EVs and listening to what you've all said, if you're going to get me out of my car, be it electric, diesel or petrol, then what I need is something that's convenient. I think I'm representatively lazy. I didn't do recycling at home until I got a box and a bin to do it in. I wouldn't go out of my way, so it had to be simple for me. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, when I thought it might, maybe it's because I work in Bristol, so it's a lot of chatter in Bristol at the moment, is don't be scared of thinking about a ban. The Bristol diesel ban in our workplace has led to a lot of discussion about how people are going to get to work and what the options are.
It's interesting that hadn't come up. When Nick and I went through the evidence of what was submitted from the public, that came up
multiple times.
Yeah.
And again, and quite detailed, well thought out
Yeah.
responses detailing exactly how you could go about it and things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that in this
Yeah.
room it didn't.
And my early priority, because electric vehicles do seem to be the low carbon next option for transport, is get that workplace charging thing sorted.
Okay, so my first one is explore the first and last mile for public transport and bike, as well as park and ride, to reflect the predominantly rural nature of Devon. My second one is I can tear off what I wrote actually because I'm reading it verbatim. So the second one is more powerfully make the case for reallocation of road space to secure political support as a means of getting schemes over the finish line. And the third thing is fiscal incentives to reduce congestion and improve use of sustainable transport and improve our air quality in urban areas.
Okay, mine was the first thing I said really, which is electric mobility, but for everybody in town and city within 5 or 10 minutes from them. Just got to make it really easy, convenient and available. So just go, oh look, there's one there, just like a bus stop. It's just got to be, so they think there's an option. I think there's a market there. 2, you've got to paint a vision, however you do that, but we've got to say what it will look like, what it will be like, how it will feel for people, how their livelihoods will be better, how they'll be healthier, but actually how they'll be more economic valuable as well. I think painting that is really important. We recently did an event where we just got as many cargo bikes we knew in Exeter, got them all in the city centre, and just got lots of different types. So look, there's lots of different types. Did you know? You know, because there's lots of people doing different things already. So you can, that was all just done by Facebook. Other social media are available. And then I'll go on the planning in terms of actually less car orientated or people first orientated planning, please. And I'll go for number 1 as my priority, which is mobility, because I think there's a demand there already. Yeah, not number 3. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, coming up with 3 is difficult. I always tell sustainable transport students they need to attack things at least 7 or 8 different policy fronts, but that's all right. I agreed very quickly, economic incentives to get people to use different modes of transport and travel differently. Secondly, high quality, mixed use brownfield development. And thirdly, bus priority in its widest sense. So not just the red paint on the bus lanes, but prioritising it as a mode. And it's all bus priority. Brackets in its widest sense. That's buying myself a fourth option, really. I think it's all about really giving people a real choice between modes. Not just, oh, I use the car because it's the easiest, but a real choice, a genuine choice. I can leave the car on the drive. So I think I'd prioritise, my number one would be bus priority on the basis that high quality brownfield mixed use development will take a while to deliver, and you can't penalise people for using their car if there aren't proper alternatives available.
So fairly similar to John, really. So yeah, I call it something different, but for ease of writing up, go for bus priority, and that is going to be my number one, because I think that is significant both in terms of its deliverability fairly rapidly, but it is symbolically important. You see it, and you can feel it, and that really matters. From the research we've done, these experiential elements for people really matter. So that is my priority. I agree with the planning one. I just wrote down here, a joint commitment from all heads of planning in Devon districts to sign up to a set of land use planning principles which they will jointly apply to every planning application from January the 1st. I don't know. But something like that is unified and simplistic, because we've seen that these things can be done. And the final one would be something like My Journey Devon app, which is this way of giving people timely, accurate information about, as John was saying, their genuine choices. What can they do? They might not from day one be able to do everything. What can they do? What will save them 5 minutes in their journey? How can they travel better? Not just travel faster, but travel better.
So apologies. I'm not a transport expert and mobility expert, so I'm a kind of an advisory member to the task force. So I've kind of relatively kept my peace and let experts get on with the main parts of the conversation. But as an idiot, I'd like to throw in my 5 pence to the end of the conversation. I think mainly to support a lot of the things that people have been saying already, particularly around the incentive side of things. But one of the sticking points for me with all of that is kind of where's that finance going to come from? Where's that support going to come from? And my way of trying to unblock that particular issue is to add to the list the idea of taking some of this to Westminster, taking it to central government, and saying, well, okay, if something immediate and something urgent is going to happen in the mobility area, as in other areas, then it requires support from Westminster to say, okay, devolution, as John was saying right at the beginning of the conversation, to give the requisite powers to local authorities to be making the decisions and to support the sort of things that Stuart's talking about with regard to the district planning authorities. The other part of it is where's the finance going to come from, and if the British government is declaring a climate emergency, how's it also going to then support the councils across the country in delivering their component of the climate emergency response through financial liberation, through financial empowerment, as it were. So I would that's the main thing that I would add to the mix.
So I want to chuck my 3 in. I think I'm kind of building on and echoing those that have already been said, but businesses in general, I think, have got a responsibility to make life easier for their employees. I know that recently, a year ago, we relocated offices at Regen, and a huge amount of work went into, firstly, discovering where people lived, how far they travel, and how they usually commute. And we're an organisation of 25 people, so it was a relatively light exercise to do. But we then chose to go for a city centre location, which is serviced by 2 good railway stations. The buses are now accessible, the park and ride is accessible, and most people can walk. So we've gone from an office of 25 where more than half drove. Some of us didn't need to. I confess I was driving a couple of miles each way. I now walk, and the rest of the office, we've gone down from probably 15 people driving to 5, and often it's less than that. So that was a conscious decision, and we're now exploring electric vehicles to try and help that further. So businesses using their sort of power to incentivise that. And on that, I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague who commutes via train from Dorset to get to Exeter a couple of times a week. And she said the thing that makes her most nervous about doing that is she's got 2 small children at home, and if the trains stop working or they go on strike, is how she gets back for her children. And something where if the organisation or organisations were to commit to offering a taxi service, that if you come by public transport, that might be a bit more inconvenient for you, but they will pay that you get back to your children, if or whatever, whoever it is that you care for, or however that helps. So if we can't improve public transport quite quickly, if we could incentivise people to do that, and they can still, their other priorities that aren't all about work can still be taken care of. Making public transport more cheaper and more reliable, I weigh most decisions up on how much it's going to cost me physically, how long it's going to take me, and then what's best for the planet. And I'm somebody that works in the sector, so at the moment the train's probably going to take me longer, it's going to cost me more, and then it's good for the planet. And I make those decisions on a work basis. I always go for what's best, but in my personal life, if it's quicker and cheaper, I probably don't. So making sure that public transport is better. And then I think the experience piece and the communications is really important. I got a bus in Bristol the other day for the first, I've not got a bus in years. And a colleague said to me, have you tried the M1 bus in Bristol? And I hadn't, and I looked it up. There's an app on the phone. It told me exactly where it was coming from. I got to the bus stop. I wasn't worried about getting on the bus the wrong way because my sense of direction is shocking. I could pay for it on there, so that even claiming expenses is easy. And it worked, and there was no traffic because we used a different lane. And it was perfect. And I've then told everybody I know that the M1 bus in Bristol is brilliant. So that kind of communication piece and having a positive experience and sharing it, I think, is important.
What's your priority? It'll be remiss of me to...
Probably businesses making life easier, I think, because most people work, I would imagine. There is an elderly part of the population and there's an unemployed part of the population, but I assume that most people go to work, and if our businesses and our employers can make it easy or make us aware of options that are available to us, I think that would help.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thanks.
I suppose, just to join in, I guess to say my 3 priorities, I think first is recognising that we are in an emergency, and we need to give due credence to the weight of that word emergency. So I think my action there is business as usual doesn't cut it. We can't stick by, and I'm a transport planner talking here, we can't stick by the appraisal processes that we have used traditionally for years and years. We cannot use TAG and use that as an excuse to keep delivering highway schemes based on travel time benefits, which disincentivise other modes. And I suppose linked to that is this piece which many people have mentioned around spatial planning and transport planning need to be better linked. And I think the line in National Policy Planning Framework Guidance, NPPF, that says development can't be prohibited unless its impacts are more than severe just needs to be dropped out completely. I'm out of a job, aren't I? I'm being recorded.
There's somebody
I suppose my second one would be backing up Will's point and a few others is the reallocation of highway space. And the point of when we actually reallocate highway space to other modes, we need to make sure it is high quality reallocation. So that is segregation. So it's not painted on bike lanes on the road. It's a fully segregated.
I still feel guilty about it.
It's a fully segregated bike lane that, allows people to feel safe when they're using it and takes them away from the traffic. And third is just a bit of a bugbear of mine. It's improving the symbolism, but I'm constantly being told, and here as a transport planner, but we're not the Netherlands, we can't do that. I was in the Netherlands on holiday earlier in the year. I travelled by train, so it was all good. But they have this great facility called Backfeet CV, I think it's called. And you can go on an app, you book your train ticket, and at the same time you can rent a bike at the station you're getting off at and use that for the day. Why can't we do something like that? My priority though is due credence to the word emergency, please, and let's not stick by our tried and tested appraisal methodology because they don't cut it in that context.
So somehow we've managed to catch up on time and we're now ready to wrap up. So thank you very much for giving up half a day to come and discuss this with us. I'd like to reassure everybody that we as the task force and Devon as the local authority leading this are going to go away and look at all of this and turn it into the action plan. So I can assure you, you have not wasted your time. This isn't consultation for consultation's sake. All of these ideas and the reason that Nick and I really wanted in that part for you to give us your actions and prioritise them is so that we can then consider that when we go back to writing the plan. So in terms of next steps for the process, as Nick said, this is the fourth hearing. There's another one tomorrow, which is energy and waste, and then there's the final summary hearings. We're then reconvening as a task force and working out what on earth we're going to do with all of this evidence, because if each of the meetings has garnered this much evidence, there's going to be a lot to go through. The call for evidence remains open, so if there is anything that you feel that you've not been able to communicate, or you've got colleagues, friends, anybody that would have sensible suggestions that would be worth considering, please get those in. That closes in early January.
It does. So the website's Devon Climate Emergency, and so it's got our social media handles on there. So please circulate it through your networks and encourage people to engage
With that, and then we will be doing a citizens' assembly next year. So the idea is that all of the evidence that experts and all of the evidence from the call for evidence, all of that will be put together, and we'll be running a citizens' assembly with people from the county to get their views before we write the actual paper and the plan as to what we're going to do. So there's still a lot of work to do, but we really appreciate all of your thoughts, and it's been really quite, I think, quite exciting for me to get all these ideas. And I don't know if you want to say any words.
No, nothing further than to echo Kerry's thanks very much for all of you for engaging with this. We appreciate it's all on your own time. It's taken time out of your day to be here. But I think hopefully you've had an engaging conversation, and I hope that you can see a positive direction of travel for us. I don't think it's going to be an easy road to get there. But maybe it's not a road, that's exactly. I need to change my vernacular. It's a good spot. It's not going to be an easy journey to get there. But yeah, I think there's an awful lot of evidence here, and I think, as I said right at the beginning, we've had a really positive response online with over 100 submissions until the 10th of November, and I think
that was 100 submissions for this one.
For mobility.
So tonight I'm reading through 100 more for the energy one tomorrow. So I think each of the themes has had a similar level of response.
I think we're up to approximately 650 submissions in total last year.
Which is great. So I think, yes, there should be a lot to come through. And watch this space. And if you feel you have more to contribute, please do.
And get in touch with us directly as well if there's anything else you wanted to discuss. And I guess we've talked about the communication and talking to people about experiences. So, it'd be great if you guys go off into your own organisations and talk about what it is Devon's trying to achieve, and, encourage their involvement as well. And, don't just let this be a one-time discussion. So I think we'll leave it there then, if there's nothing else. Did you need to add anything? No?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Toys aren't coming, you know that, don't you?
Thank you very much.